There are philosophers who build systems. They create vast, intricate cathedrals of thought, designed to explain the whole of reality, to provide a foundation for truth, and to give us a secure place to live. And then there are philosophers who carry a hammer. Friedrich Nietzsche was a philosopher with a hammer. He did not come to build. He came to test, to strike, to listen for the hollow sound that would reveal the decay within. His entire life's work was a radical and relentless act of philosophical demolition. He was the great diagnostician of the modern age, a cultural physician who looked at the proud civilization of 19th-century Europe and saw not a healthy, thriving organism, but a patient in the advanced stages of a terminal illness. And the cause of this illness, he argued, was the very thing we considered to be our greatest virtue, our morality. This masterclass is a journey into the mind of this dangerous, electrifying, and profoundly misunderstood thinker. It is an encounter with a man whose ideas were, in his own words, dynamite. His entire project was driven by a single terrifying question. A question that, once you truly hear it, will shake the foundations of your own most deeply held beliefs. The question is this: have our values, our concepts of good and evil, our religions, our philosophies, have they made humanity stronger, healthier, nobler, and more life-affirming? Or have they, in fact, been a secret and terrible poison? Have they been a 2,000-year-long conspiracy against life itself, a system designed to tame, to weaken, and to domesticate the human animal, breeding a race of comfortable, mediocre, and spiritually impoverished creatures? Nietzsche does not offer us comfortable answers. He does not offer us a new system to believe in. His purpose is to force us to question everything. The value of truth, the origin of our conscience, the holiness of our saints, the goodness of our good men. The biographical agony of Friedrich Nietzsche was not the physical pain of his chronic illnesses, though that was immense. His true agony was his profound and almost unbearable intellectual solitude. He was a prophet who saw a spiritual catastrophe on the horizon that no one else could see. He was a man who lived a full century ahead of his time, and this vision condemned him to a life of being almost completely misunderstood. His warnings were not heard, they were dismissed as the ravings of a madman. And in the end, the sheer, crushing weight of his own insights may have been one of the very things that shattered his brilliant mind. In this series, we will follow him as he takes his hammer to the great hollow idols of the Western tradition. We will witness his attack on traditional morality, as he performs a genealogy of morals to uncover the ugly, all-too-human origins of our concepts of good and evil. We will stand with him at the abyss as he makes his most famous and most terrifying proclamation, the death of God, and we will explore his prophecy of the nihilism that would follow. We will examine his assault on philosophical truth itself, his radical idea that there are no absolute facts, only interpretations, each driven by a hidden will to power. And we will confront his critique of social progress and his horrifying vision of the last man, the endpoint of our modern democratic ideals of comfort and security. But Nietzsche was not only a destroyer, he was a creator. After he had cleared the ground, after he had shattered the old life-denying values, he sought to offer humanity a new, life-affirming vision. And so, we will also explore his profound and challenging prescription for a new kind of humanity. We will explore his central concept of the will to power, the fundamental driving engine of all life. We will try to understand his most notorious and most misunderstood ideal, the Übermensch, or the Overman. Not a fascist Superman, but a creator who overcomes nihilism by forging his own values. And we will wrestle with his most profound and personal thought experiments, the challenge of amor fati, to love one's fate, and the ultimate test of the eternal recurrence, the question of whether you are living a life you would be willing to repeat in every single detail, for all eternity. This journey will not be easy. Nietzsche does not want to comfort you. He wants to challenge you. He wants to awaken you. His writing is not a gentle argument, it is a declaration of war against the spiritual sleepwalking of the modern age. This is the dangerous invitation of Friedrich Nietzsche. He does not offer you a new system to believe in. He offers you a hammer to shatter the one you already inhabit. He teaches that the path to a stronger and more authentic life does not begin with finding new answers, but with having the courage to destroy all the old ones. To become a creator, you must first be a destroyer. And to find your own truth, you must first be willing to risk the terrifying freedom of a world with no truth at all. This hammer, this weapon of devastating intellectual force that would shatter the idols of an entire civilization, was not forged in a vacuum. It was forged in the life of a man who was a walking contradiction, a profound and tragic paradox. His entire existence was a war against his own origins. To understand the philosopher who declared that God is dead, we must first understand that he was the son and the grandson of a Lutheran pastor. Friedrich Nietzsche was born in 1844 in a small, quiet village in Prussia. His childhood was not one of rebellion, it was one of profound and suffocating piety. He grew up in a house filled with Bibles, hymns, and devout women. His father, whom he adored, died when he was only 5, a tragic event that cast a long shadow over his entire life. He was a brilliant, serious, and deeply religious boy. At his boarding school, he was so known for his solemn demeanor and his ability to recite biblical passages from memory that his classmates nicknamed him the Little Pastor. His path seemed set. He was destined to become the 5th generation of his family to enter the service of the church. But alongside this piety, another force was at work in him, a brilliant and restless intellect. He was a prodigy, particularly in the field of classical philology, the rigorous study of ancient Greek and Roman texts. His genius was so undeniable that in 1869, at the unprecedented and still astonishing age of 24, he was appointed to be a full professor of philology at the University of Basel in Switzerland. He was given the position before he had even completed his doctorate. This is a crucial fact to understand. The man who would later launch the most radical and seemingly insane attack on Western tradition was not an ignorant outsider. He was a master of that tradition. He knew the ancient texts, the philosophical arguments, and the history of Western thought better than almost anyone of his generation. He was not throwing stones from outside the cathedral, he was dismantling it from the inside, because he knew exactly where every single stone had been laid. In these early years, as a young professor, his life was dominated by 2 great intellectual and spiritual influences. The first was the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. Nietzsche discovered his work as a student and was immediately electrified. Schopenhauer taught a dark, pessimistic philosophy, that the universe is not a rational, ordered place, but is driven by a blind, irrational, and endlessly striving force he called the will. Life for Schopenhauer was a cycle of meaningless suffering, and the only escape was a kind of Buddhist-like denial of the will. For the young Nietzsche, this was a powerful and liberating revelation. It was the first great alternative he had found to the Christian worldview of his childhood. The second, and far more powerful, influence was the composer Richard Wagner. For Nietzsche, Wagner was not just a musician. He was a cultural messiah. He was the artistic genius who would redeem German culture from the sterile rationalism of the Enlightenment and the shallow materialism of the modern age. He would do this, Nietzsche believed, by creating a new, mythic art form that would have the same profound, transformative power that Greek tragedy had for the ancient Greeks. The 2 men met, and their friendship was immediate and intense. It was the relationship of a worshipful son to a powerful, charismatic father figure. They would spend long hours together, sharing their grand vision for a cultural rebirth. But this period of belonging would not last. The biographical agony of Nietzsche's life was a series of profound and painful breaks, a lifelong journey into an ever-deepening solitude. The first break was with academia. In 1872, he published his first book, The Birth of Tragedy. It was not the kind of dry, scholarly work his colleagues expected. It was a passionate, poetic, and deeply philosophical book that completely scandalized the academic world. They dismissed it as the work of a madman, not a serious scholar. The book was a professional disaster, and Nietzsche realized that the safe, comfortable, and timid world of the university was not a place where his revolutionary ideas could grow. The second break was far more personal and far more devastating. It was his break with Wagner. Over time, Nietzsche came to see his hero as a fraud. He saw Wagner's growing German nationalism as a betrayal of his universal artistic vision, and most damningly, he saw Wagner's final opera, Parsifal, with its themes of Christian pity and redemption, as a complete and total surrender to the very life-denying slave morality that Nietzsche was beginning to despise. He saw his great hero as having knelt before the cross, as having betrayed their shared mission. The break was absolute and brutal. He had lost his only true friend, his father figure, and the one man he believed was his peer. These two divorces from academia and from Wagner cast Nietzsche out into the wilderness. For the last decade of his productive life, from 1879 until his final collapse in 1889, he was a solitary wanderer. He resigned his professorship due to his ever-worsening health and lived on a small pension. He had no home, no job, no family in the traditional sense. He moved restlessly between cheap boarding houses in the Swiss Alps in the summer and the Italian Riviera in the winter. This was the period of his greatest philosophical creativity. It was the life of a prophet in the desert. He would walk for up to 8 hours a day through the mountains, his mind on fire with the ideas that would become his most famous books. But this was also a period of almost unimaginable physical suffering. He was plagued by blinding migraine headaches, by violent fits of vomiting, by failing eyesight that made it difficult for him to read and write. His great life-affirming philosophy, his gospel of health and strength, was written by a man who was almost never healthy a day in his life. And so we find the man behind the hammer, a man born into the deepest faith who became its greatest enemy. A brilliant academic who had to abandon the university to find his true voice. A man who craved a disciple but was condemned to an almost total solitude. His philosophy was not born from comfort. It was born from a crucible of physical pain and profound loneliness. He had to lose his God, his career, and his only friend, to finally become himself. From this crucible of solitude, illness, and intellectual rebellion, Nietzsche began his great assault. He took up his hammer, not to attack the decorative fringes of Western thought, but to strike at its absolute center, at the single foundational pillar that had supported the entire moral and metaphysical structure of the West for 2 millennia. And with one of the most famous, most misunderstood, and most terrifying proclamations in the history of philosophy, he declared that this foundation had not just cracked, but had crumbled into dust. He announced the death of God. To understand this catastrophic event, we must turn to a short, explosive parable from his book The Gay Science. This is the story of the madman. A madman appears in the marketplace in the bright morning hours. He has lit a lantern and is running through the crowds, crying out incessantly, "I seek God, I seek God." The people in the marketplace, who are themselves atheists, do not take him seriously. They mock him. They laugh. Did God get lost? They ask. Has he gone on a voyage? Is he hiding? The madman, enraged by their shallow, thoughtless disbelief, leaps into their midst and pierces them with his gaze. "Where is God?" he cries. "I will tell you. We have killed him, you and I. We are all his murderers." He then begins to describe the sheer cosmic scale of what has happened. He asks, how were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? The crowd is stunned into silence. The madman realizes they do not understand. He says, "I have come too early. My time has not yet come. This tremendous event is still on its way. Still wandering, it has not yet reached the ears of men." He tells them that the news of a star dying takes time to reach a distant planet. The deed of killing God, he says, is still more distant to them than the most distant stars, and yet they have done it themselves. He then enters a church and sings a requiem, a funeral mass for God. When asked what he is doing, he replies, "What after all are these churches now, if they are not the tombs and sepulchres of God?" This is not a triumphant cry of atheism, this is a scream of cosmic horror. What did Nietzsche mean by this? He was not making a simple theological claim that a literal personal God does not exist. That for him was already obvious and uninteresting. The death of God was a cultural diagnosis. It was his observation that the Christian God, as the central unifying source of all value, all meaning, and all morality in the West, had ceased to be believable. The foundation had been eroding for centuries. The scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, the rise of historical criticism, all of these forces, which we celebrated as progress, had been chipping away at the credibility of the Christian worldview. The we who have killed him are not just the atheists. It is all of us. It is the pious believer who attends church, but whose life is fundamentally governed by worldly, not spiritual, values. It is the scientist whose method presupposes a universe without divine intervention. It is the modern state that bases its legitimacy on the will of the people, not the will of God. We, as a civilization, had rendered God irrelevant. We had made him unbelievable, and we had not yet even begun to understand the consequences. Nietzsche uses the powerful metaphor of unchaining the earth from its sun. For 2,000 years, the Christian God had been the sun, the absolute center of the Western cosmos. It was the source of all light and all gravity. It was the fixed point that gave our world its orientation, its meaning, its warmth. Now, that sun has been extinguished, and we, the murderers, do not yet realize what we have done. We are like a planet that has been flung from its orbit, hurtling into an infinite, cold, and empty darkness. And we do not yet feel the chill. The immediate consequence of the death of God, Nietzsche prophesied, would be the coming of a new and terrible guest to European civilization. He called it nihilism. Nihilism, from the Latin nihil, meaning nothing, is the state that follows the collapse of all our highest values. It is the horrifying realization that our concepts of good and evil have no cosmic foundation, that our existence has no inherent purpose or meaning, that all of our striving is, in the final analysis, for nothing. Nietzsche saw that this nihilism would manifest in two distinct forms. The first, and most common, would be a passive nihilism. This is not a dramatic, violent state. It is a state of profound weariness, of quiet despair, of a slow, creeping spiritual exhaustion. This is the condition of the last man, the pathetic creature that Nietzsche describes in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The last man is the human being who has come at the end of history after the death of God and the collapse of all great aspirations. His only goal in life is comfort, security, and a kind of trivial, mindless happiness. He takes no risks. He has no great loves and no great hatreds. He no longer looks up at the stars and asks the big questions. He works a little for his daily bread and a little for his pleasure. The last man is the final, pathetic outcome of our modern ideals of equality and utilitarianism. He is a creature without a chest, without a longing for anything beyond his own petty contentment. And he blinks, Nietzsche says, in his confusion. This vision of a comfortable, meaningless, and spiritually empty world was, for Nietzsche, a far more terrifying hell than any described by the theologians. It is the slow death of the human spirit. But he also foresaw a second, more violent response to the death of God: active nihilism. This is the nihilism of the person who cannot bear the meaninglessness. This is the person who, realizing that all the old values are dead, feels the need to smash the tablets, to tear down the temples, to destroy the last remnants of the old dead world. This is the nihilism of the revolutionary, the terrorist, the man who, like Dostoevsky's demons, is driven by a desire not to create, but simply to destroy. If nothing is true, then everything is permitted. Active nihilism is the violent rage that erupts in the void left by God's absence. It is the prelude to the catastrophic political movements of the 20th century. The biographical agony of this entire prophecy was Nietzsche's own profound solitude. He was the madman. He was the prophet who had arrived too early. He felt the full, cold, cosmic weight of the death of God in his own soul, while the people around him were still laughing in the marketplace, blissfully unaware of the cataclysm that was unfolding. He was not just a diagnostician of this spiritual illness. He was its first and most tormented patient. He had to live through the terror of this new, godless reality alone, long before the rest of the world had even begun to suspect that something was wrong. His philosophy is the record of his own heroic and ultimately tragic struggle to find a way to live a meaningful life in a world without God. His great question, the question that would drive the rest of his philosophy, was this: how can humanity overcome nihilism? How can we stare into the abyss of a meaningless universe and not be destroyed by it? How can we, the murderers of God, now become gods ourselves, creating a new set of values that will affirm life rather than deny it? This is Nietzsche's harrowing prophecy. He announced that the single greatest event in the last 2,000 years of history had already occurred, and nobody had even noticed. We had untethered the earth from its sun and did not yet feel the cold. The death of God was not an act of liberation that would make us free. It was an act of cosmic deicide that had turned us all into murderers, adrift in an infinite, empty, and meaningless night, with the blood of the sacred on our hands. This great spiritual illness, this passive nihilism that follows the death of God, is not just a philosophical concept for Nietzsche, it is a human destiny. It is the future that awaits a civilization that has lost its connection to any higher value, to any great commanding goal. It is the slow, creeping, spiritual heat death of the human race. Nietzsche was a prophet, and like all great prophets, he did not just diagnose the disease. He showed his audience a terrifying vision of what the final stages of that disease would look like. He gave this future a face, a voice, and a name. He called it the last man. To understand this horrifying figure, we must turn to Nietzsche's most poetic and personal book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The book begins with the prophet, Zarathustra, descending from a decade of solitary contemplation in the mountains. He comes to the people in the marketplace to share his great, life-affirming wisdom. His goal is to teach them about the next stage of human evolution, the goal that humanity must now set for itself. He comes to teach them about the Übermensch, the overmensch. But the people in the marketplace are not interested. They are a modern, cynical, and sophisticated crowd. They do not want to be challenged. They do not want to be given a difficult, aspirational goal. They mock him. Zarathustra, in a moment of profound disgust and disappointment, realizes that they are not yet ready for his gift. Before he can teach them about the great human being they could become, he must first show them the contemptible creature they are actively choosing to become. So, he changes his sermon. He decides to preach to them about the most disgusting and pathetic thing he can imagine. He decides to show them a vision of their own future. He preaches the gospel of the last man. Alas, he cries, the time is coming when man will no longer give birth to a star. Alas, the time of the most contemptible man is coming. He that is no longer able to despise himself. Behold, I show you the last man. And then he begins his description. The world of the last man is a world that has perfected the art of happiness. But it is a very small, very trivial kind of happiness. We have invented happiness, say the last men, and they blame their highest value, the central organizing principle of their entire civilization, is the elimination of all hardship. They have engineered a world without risk, without struggle, without pain. A world of total comfort and total security. A little poison now and then, that makes for pleasant dreams, they say, and a lot of poison at the end for a pleasant death. They have replaced the search for meaning with the search for health. Their God is not a transcendent creator, but the doctor who can prolong their lives. They are obsessed with their physical well-being, with their diets, with their small, harmless pleasures. In the world of the last man, there are no more great ambitions. There is no more striving for greatness. The very concepts of overcoming, of self-mastery, of aspiring to something higher than oneself, have been forgotten. They are seen as forms of sickness, as relics from a more foolish and chaotic time. Formerly all the world was mad, say the last men, and they blink. They are clever. They have read all the books. They know everything that has ever happened. And because they know everything, they believe there is nothing left to discover, nothing left to create, nothing left to strive for. There are no more great loves and no more great hatreds. There are no more powerful, life-altering passions. Everything has been tamed, domesticated, and reduced to a safe, manageable, and ultimately meaningless level. Their society is the final, logical endpoint of the democratic and egalitarian ideals that Nietzsche saw rising all around him in 19th century Europe. No shepherd in one herd is their motto. Everybody wants the same. Everybody is the same. Whoever feels different goes voluntarily into a madhouse. There is no more hierarchy, no more distinction between the noble and the base. There is no one who wants to rule, and no one who wants to be ruled, because both are seen as too troublesome. It is a world of perfect, stable, and completely soul-crushing mediocrity. It is the ant-hill that Dostoevsky had warned of, finally achieved. And what of the last man's inner life? He has no inner life. He is a creature of the surface. He has no great suffering, and therefore no capacity for great joy. He has no great doubts, and therefore no capacity for a profound faith. He is a creature who is no longer able to despise himself and therefore has lost the very engine of all self-overcoming. He just is. He works a little. He plays a little. He has his small, daily pleasures, and he blinks. This blinking is the key to his entire psychology. It is the physical manifestation of his spiritual emptiness. It is a sign of his incomprehension, his shallow, surface-level engagement with the world. He looks upon the great drama of existence, the beauty, the terror, the mystery, and he feels nothing. He simply blinks. This was the biographical agony of Friedrich Nietzsche. He looked at the political and social movements of his own time, and he saw them all as a conspiracy to create this contemptible creature. He saw it in the English utilitarians, with their simple-minded focus on achieving the greatest happiness for the greatest number. He saw it in the socialists, with their dream of a classless society free from all struggle and want. He saw it in the Democrats, with their celebration of equality and the herd instinct. His great, lonely, and agonizing struggle was a war against the future. He was a prophet, screaming a warning at a civilization that was joyfully and self-righteously running towards the very spiritual abyss he was describing. He was not just a detached observer. He felt this cultural decline as a personal, physical illness. The smallness, the pettiness, the lack of aspiration he saw in the modern world caused him a kind of spiritual nausea. The last man, then, is Nietzsche's great warning. The Übermensch is the difficult, aspirational goal he will set for humanity. But the last man is the danger. He is the default outcome. He is what we will become if we fail to rise to the terrifying challenge of the death of God. He is the final pathetic face of passive nihilism. He is a creature who has solved all the problems of life, and in doing so has eliminated any reason to live. This is Nietzsche's most chilling and uncomfortable prophecy. He presents us with a vision of a world that has achieved everything our modern compassionate and progressive ideologies claim to want. A world without poverty, without sickness, without war, without suffering. A world of perfect equality, security, and happiness. And he asks us to see it not as a utopia, but as the ultimate spiritual catastrophe. The greatest danger to the future of humanity, he warns, is not a great evil, but the complete and total absence of the will to be great. This horrifying vision of the last man, this creature of pure comfort and spiritual emptiness, is the endpoint of a long and complex historical process. It is the final, exhausted sigh of a civilization that has lost its way. But where did this process begin? How did our values come to be what they are? To understand the sickness of the modern soul, Nietzsche knew he had to diagnose its origin. He had to become a new kind of historian, a moral archaeologist. He had to dig down through the centuries of accumulated philosophical dust to unearth the hidden, and often ugly history of our most sacred values. This is the radical and revolutionary project of his great masterpiece on the genealogy of morals. For more than 2,000 years, Western philosophers had asked the question, what is good? They had tried to define the nature of goodness, to find a rational foundation for morality, to create a universal system of ethics. Nietzsche, with his hammer, comes to shatter this entire tradition. He asks a different and far more dangerous question. He does not ask, what is good? He asks, what is the value of our values? This is a crucial distinction. He is not just trying to define goodness. He is putting goodness itself on trial. He is asking, has our dominant morality, the Judeo-Christian morality that has governed the West for 2 millennia, actually been good for humanity? Has it made us stronger, healthier, prouder, more creative, more life-affirming? Or has it, in fact, been a force of decadence and decline? Has it been a subtle and powerful poison that has weakened the human species and paved the way for the coming of the last man? To answer this question, he knew he could not rely on the lazy, ahistorical assumptions of the philosophers who came before him. He needed a new method. He needed a genealogy. A genealogy is an investigation into origins, into lineage, into descent. Nietzsche became a historian of our moral language. He wanted to know, where did our words good and evil actually come from? Who were the first people to use these words, and what did they mean by them? His primary target in this investigation was a group of thinkers he contemptuously referred to as the English psychologists. These were the early utilitarians and moral philosophers of his day. They had a very simple, very tidy, and in Nietzsche's view, a completely absurd theory about the origin of morality. They argued that, originally, the word good was applied to actions that were unegoistic and useful to the community. People who received these acts of kindness praised them as good, and over time, this praise became a habit. We simply forgot the utilitarian origin of the word and came to believe that being good was a virtue in itself. Nietzsche looked at this explanation with absolute scorn. He found it historically and psychologically naive. It was a boring, gray, and completely bloodless theory, concocted by comfortable scholars in a peaceful society. It had no sense of the real, tragic, and often violent history of human values. It completely ignored the role of power, of struggle, and of the will of different groups to impose their values on the world. So, Nietzsche, the brilliant classical philologist, decided to do his own investigation. He began by looking for clues, not in abstract theories, but in the history of language itself. He asked a simple, philological question: what is the etymology of the word good in different ancient languages? And he made a groundbreaking discovery. He found that in almost every case, from the Greek and the Latin to the Gaelic and the Germanic, the word for good was etymologically linked to the words for noble, aristocratic, powerful, high-minded, and warrior-like. The word good did not originally mean unselfish. It meant noble. It was a term that the ruling classes, the powerful, healthy, and high-spirited aristocrats of the ancient world, used to describe themselves. It was a direct and spontaneous expression of their own feeling of power and superiority. Correspondingly, he found that the word bad originally just meant common, plebeian, lowly, simple. It was not a moral condemnation. It was a sociological description. It was simply the term the nobles used to describe the powerless common people who were beneath them. This was Nietzsche's first great discovery. The original form of morality, the master morality as he would call it, was not about altruism or utility. It was an act of pure self-affirmation by a ruling class. Good was simply a name for their own strength, their own pride, and their own will to power. This then led him to a second, even more profound question. If good originally meant noble and bad simply meant common, where in the world did our modern and completely opposite concept of evil come from? The noble Roman warrior did not see his enemy as evil. He saw him as a worthy opponent or as a contemptible weakling. The idea of a morally evil enemy, a creature who deserved to be damned, was a completely different invention. And who, Nietzsche asked, would have a motive to invent such a concept? This is the great mystery that the rest of his genealogy sets out to solve. He had discovered that the history of morality was not a single linear story. It was the story of a great and terrible conflict, a war between two fundamentally opposed value systems that had been raging for thousands of years. The biographical agony that fueled this entire project was Nietzsche's own profound and personal struggle against the moral inheritance of his time. He was a man who had been raised in the very heart of the Christian pastoral tradition. He was taught, from his earliest childhood, that good meant humility, pity, compassion for the weak, and the suppression of one's own prideful instincts. His genealogical project was an act of profound and violent self-overcoming. It was his attempt to dig himself out from under the weight of this 2,000-year-old moral system, a system that he had come to see as a sophisticated and beautiful justification for human weakness and decay. To do this work, he had to become, in his own words, an immoralist. He had to force himself to stand outside the very concepts of good and evil that had defined his entire culture and his own upbringing. This was a position of extreme and almost unbearable psychological and social isolation. This investigation revealed to him that our modern morality is not a unified whole. It is a chaotic and contradictory battlefield. Our modern souls are a hybrid, a mixture of two fundamentally opposed value systems that are at war with each other. On one side, there is the ancient, aristocratic, master morality, the morality that says yes to life, that values strength, pride, and nobility, and on the other side, there is the slave morality, the morality of the herd, born from resentment, that values pity, humility, and equality. Our entire modern world, with all its confusion and all its inner conflicts, is the result of this ancient and still ongoing war. This is the shocking and uncomfortable foundation of Nietzsche's moral investigation. He forces us to confront the possibility that our most sacred and deeply held values, our belief in compassion and equality and the virtue of the humble, are not divine commandments handed down from heaven. They are weapons forged in the fires of history by a particular group of people to wage a spiritual war against their enemies. The history of morality is not the story of humanity's slow ascent to the good. It is the story of a battle, and to understand who we are, we must first have the courage to ask which side won, and what price we are still paying for that victory. Understood. I will ensure this part strictly adheres to the 2,000-word count, formatted in short paragraphs with only the spoken words. This great historical battle, this 2,000-year-long war for the soul of humanity, began with an original, primordial system of values. Before the great inversion, before the invention of the concept of evil, there was a different and more ancient way of seeing the world. To understand the war, we must first have the courage to understand the world that was lost. We must explore the ethics of the noble soul. We must explore what Nietzsche called the master morality. This is the morality of the ancient, aristocratic, and life-affirming ruling classes. It is the worldview of the Homeric Greek heroes, of the Roman patricians, of the Viking chieftains. It is the morality of a people who are strong, healthy, and in command of their own destiny. The absolute, fundamental difference between this morality and every other is the source of its values. The noble, the master, is a creator of values. He does not look outside of himself for a standard of what is good. He does not consult a sacred text, a divine commandment, or the opinion of the community. Value flows from him. His judgment, this is good, is what makes it good. His morality is a direct and spontaneous expression of his own feeling of power, of his own overflowing strength, of his own triumphant yes to life. Think of it like a great artist. A revolutionary artist does not follow a pre-existing rulebook on how to create a beautiful painting. They do not conform to the established tastes of their time. They create from their own inner vision, from their own will, and their creation sets a new standard for what is considered beautiful. The noble soul creates moral values in exactly the same way. Their own actions, their own character, their own instincts become the standard by which all things are judged. Goodness is not something they conform to, it is something they embody. The psychological foundation for this way of being is a feeling that Nietzsche called the pathos of distance. This is not a reasoned, logical argument for one's own superiority. It is a deep, instinctual, and unshakable feeling of separation from those who are beneath. It is the profound and constant awareness of the vast chasm that separates the noble from the common, the strong from the weak, the master from the slave. This feeling, this pathos, is the very source of their ability to create values. Because they feel themselves to be of a higher order, they grant themselves the right to name the world according to their own perspective. From this self-affirming foundation, a specific set of virtues naturally arises. These are the virtues of the master. First and foremost is pride, a deep and abiding reverence for oneself, for one's own power, and for one's own judgment. This is not the modern sin of vanity, but a profound sense of self-worth that is independent of the opinions of others. Next is courage. Not just the physical courage of the warrior, but a deeper spiritual courage. An embrace of challenge, of hardship, of danger. The noble soul does not seek a life of safety and comfort. They seek a life of glorious struggle, because it is only in the face of great resistance that their strength can be fully expressed and enjoyed. There is also a profound sense of honor and duty. But these duties are not to everyone. They are duties to one's peers, to one's equals. It is a loyalty to one's own kind, to one's ancestors, and to the traditions that have made one strong. The noble warrior has a deep respect for a worthy enemy. This is a crucial distinction. The master does not feel the poisonous, resentful hatred that we will encounter later. He can respect and even admire an opponent who is also strong, courageous, and honorable. The battle is a test of strength, not a moral crusade. And finally, there is generosity. The noble can be generous, merciful, and kind. But this kindness does not come from a place of pity for the weak. Pity is seen as a form of contempt. Their generosity comes from an overflow of power. They give and they help not because they feel sorry for others, but because their own strength and wealth are so great that they can afford to. It is an expression of their magnificence. So what in this system is bad? The bad, for the master, is everything that is not him. It is the common, the plebeian, the weak, the timid, the cowardly. It is the man who is concerned only with his own narrow utility and safety. But it is crucial to understand that this is not a moral condemnation. It is a statement of contempt, of looking down upon. The noble does not see the common man as evil. He sees him as pathetic, as laughable, as simply bad, in the sense of being poorly made, like a dull sword or a lame horse. The biographical agony that haunts Nietzsche's writing on this topic is his profound sense of historical and cultural loss. As a classical philologist, he had spent the best years of his life immersed in the world of the ancient Greeks. He had lived in their texts. He felt the power, the nobility, the magnificent, life-affirming spirit of their heroes and their philosophers in his own soul. He saw in them a healthier, stronger, and more admirable form of humanity. And then he would look up from his books at the men of his own time, at 19th-century Europeans, and he was filled with a profound sense of disgust. He saw a world dominated by what he called the shopkeeper mentality. He saw men who valued comfort over honor, security over adventure, and a trivial happiness over a glorious struggle. He saw the triumph of the democratic, egalitarian, and Christian values that had in his view systematically bred all the nobility and strength out of the human soul. His agony was that of a man who felt he had been born in the wrong century. He was an ancient Roman soul trapped in a world of modern, mediocre, last men. His entire philosophical project was a passionate, desperate, and ultimately tragic attempt to find a way to resurrect this noble, aristocratic spirit in a modern age that had declared war on all forms of greatness. He knew it could not be brought back in its old, naive form. That was the source of his tragic vision. This is Nietzsche's great, unsettling challenge to our modern democratic conscience. He asks us to look back at the origins of everything we admire, our art, our courage, our very concept of greatness, and to admit that it was all born from a profoundly aristocratic, unequal, and by our standards, immoral worldview. The values that created the beautiful, the strong, and the admirable human being were not born from a compassionate concern for the herd. They were born from the noble soul's magnificent and glorious celebration of itself. To understand the root of human greatness, he insists, we must first have the courage to admire the morality of the master. This world of the noble soul, this morality of the master, was the dominant value system of the ancient world. It was a morality of strength, of pride, of a great and triumphant yes to life. But it is not the morality that we, in the modern world, have inherited. Something happened. A great and terrible event took place in the spiritual history of humanity. A secret, slow, silent, and brilliant act of revenge that would invert all the ancient values and poison the wellspring of Western culture for 2,000 years. Nietzsche called this event the slave revolt in morality. To understand this revolt, we must first understand the psychological condition of those who began it. We must leave the sunlit world of the noble warrior and descend into the dark subterranean world of the slave, the oppressed, the weak, and the powerless. The master morality, as we have seen, is born from a position of strength. But what kind of morality is born from a position of profound and prolonged suffering? What kind of values are created by a people who are humiliated, beaten, and denied any form of direct action? The psychological engine that drives this new morality, Nietzsche argues, is a single, toxic, and immensely creative emotion. He uses the French word for it, ressentiment. Ressentiment is not simple anger or hatred. It is the vengeful, impotent rage of the powerless. It is a festering, brooding resentment against an enemy that you are too weak to fight openly. Because it cannot be discharged through direct action, this hatred turns inward. It becomes a poison that contaminates the entire soul. But it also becomes clever. It becomes spiritual. It becomes creative. It learns to wait. And it learns to create a new kind of weapon, a weapon of values. The slave revolt begins here, in the dark cellar of ressentiment. Remember, the master morality creates its values with a great act of self-affirmation. The noble soul looks at itself and says, "I am good." It then, as an afterthought, looks at the common people and dismisses them as bad. The primary act is a yes to the self. The slave morality, born of ressentiment, does the exact opposite. Its first act is not a yes to itself. Its first act is a great and resounding no to the outside world. It looks outward at the master, at the noble, at the happy and powerful warrior who is the source of its suffering, and it performs its first and greatest creative act. It invents a new concept in the human universe. It declares, "You are evil." This is the birth of evil as we know it. For the noble Roman, his enemy was not evil, he was just a contemptible opponent to be crushed. But for the man of ressentiment, his enemy, his master, is the embodiment of a metaphysical and moral evil. He is the evil one, who must be punished, not just in this life, but for all eternity. Every quality of the master, his strength, his pride, his health, his love of life, his sensuality, is now reconceived as a mark of this evil. Once the slave morality has created its great enemy, the evil master, it then performs its second creative act. It defines good as an afterthought. And what is good? Good, in this new system, is everything that the master is not. Good is everything that the slave is. The slave's own weakness, their inability to take revenge, is now reframed as the beautiful virtue of patience. Their necessary humility, their need to be subservient to survive, is now called the sacred virtue of humility. Their inability to harm anyone is reframed as the moral excellence of goodness. The act of forgiving one's enemies, something a noble warrior would find contemptible, is now praised as the highest virtue, because it is the only form of revenge available to the truly powerless. And pity, the feeling for the suffering, the weak and the downtrodden, which the master morality despised as a form of sickness, now becomes the virtue of all virtues, the very definition of a good person. This is the slave revolt in morality. It is a complete and total transvaluation of all values. It is a breathtakingly brilliant act of spiritual revenge. The weak have discovered a way to conquer the strong. They cannot do it with swords and spears, so they do it with values. They have convinced the masters themselves that the very instincts of the master, his pride, his strength, his will to power, are morally evil. And they have convinced them that the characteristics of the slave, humility, pity, meekness, are the only path to goodness and to salvation. Who, Nietzsche asks, were the geniuses behind this incredible act of historical and psychological warfare? He controversially identifies the priestly caste, and specifically the Jewish priests of antiquity, as the originators of this revolt. The priest, he argues, is the most clever and the most resentful of all human types. He is physically powerless compared to the warrior aristocracy, but he possesses a far more subtle and far more potent will to power, the will of the spirit. He fights his battles not with weapons, but with ideas. It was the priestly class, Nietzsche claims, who, out of their resentment towards the warrior nobles, first performed this great inversion of values. And it was Christianity, particularly the version of it shaped by the genius of St. Paul, that took this new slave morality and made it the dominant value system of the Western world. Christianity, for Nietzsche, was the vehicle that carried this sophisticated spiritual poison from a small, oppressed corner of Judea and used it to conquer the entire, noble and life-affirming Roman Empire from within. The biographical agony that haunts this entire analysis is, once again, Nietzsche's own. He was the pastor's son. He was raised in the very heart of this slave morality. He was taught from his first breath that humility, compassion, and pity were the highest goods, and that pride and a powerful will were the greatest sins. His genealogical project was a war against himself. It was a brutal act of self-analysis, an attempt to understand the historical origins of the very values that had been bred into his own bones. His agony was the profound and horrifying realization that the morality he had been taught to revere as the Word of God was, in his view, born from the most poisonous and life-denying of all human emotions, the vengeful hatred of the weak. It was a disillusionment so total that it forced him to stand completely alone, an immoralist in a world that could no longer see any other way to be. The triumph of this slave revolt, he argues, is now so complete that we are no longer even aware that it was a revolt. We are like fish who do not know they are in water. We simply assume that good means selfless, humble, compassionate, and meek. We have forgotten that for most of human history, good meant the exact opposite. He saw this morality's victory everywhere, in the rise of democracy, which celebrates the equality of the herd, in the rise of socialism, which champions the cause of the oppressed, in all modern movements that praise the common man and are suspicious of the great individual. These are all, for him, the secular children of this ancient spiritual poison. This is Nietzsche's most scandalous and explosive historical claim. He argues that the greatest and most successful act of revenge in all of human history was not waged with swords and armies, but with values. It was a secret, spiritual war, won by the weak against the strong. A war so total that the victors have erased even the memory of the values they overthrew. They took their own powerlessness and called it goodness. They took their own resentment and called it justice, and they took their own vengeful hatred and called it love. And we, the inheritors of this 2,000-year-old victory, are the proud and unknowing children of this magnificent and world-conquering slave revolt. This great slave revolt in morality, this triumphant 2,000-year-long spiritual war waged by the weak against the strong, did not happen by accident. It was not a chaotic uprising. It was guided, shaped, and perfected by a single, powerful, and strangely seductive idea. An idea that has dominated the spiritual and intellectual life of humanity for millennia. An ideal that has been championed not only by priests and saints, but by the great philosophers and artists of the West as well. This is the great and terrible power of the ascetic ideal. To understand Nietzsche's thought, we must now follow him into the third and final essay of his Genealogy of Morals, where he asks his most penetrating question yet. What is the meaning of ascetic ideals? What does it mean when a human being, a creature of flesh and blood, a being driven by instincts and a will to live, comes to believe that the highest form of existence is the systematic denial of life itself? What does it mean to praise poverty, humility, and chastity? What is the value of this value system? Why has this seemingly life-denying ideal been the most powerful and dominant force on the planet for thousands of years? Nietzsche's answer is a masterpiece of psychological diagnosis. He argues that the ascetic ideal is not, as it appears, a rejection of the will to power. It is, in fact, the most subtle, the most clever, and the most dangerously successful manifestation of the will to power ever devised. To understand this, we must first meet the primary agent of this ideal, its great practitioner and promoter. This is the figure of the ascetic priest. The ascetic priest, in Nietzsche's analysis, is a kind of doctor. He comes to a community that is sick. The great suffering mass of humanity, the herd, is physiologically and psychologically ill. They are filled with weariness, with depression, with a deep and gnawing sense of meaninglessness. This suffering needs an explanation, and the ascetic priest is the one who provides it. He performs a great act of psychological jujitsu. He takes the free-floating resentment of the weak, their ressentiment, and he turns it inward. He gives their suffering a cause. He tells them, "You are not suffering because of your masters, or because of your enemies, or because the world is unjust. You are suffering because of you. You are a sinner. You are guilty." This, Nietzsche argues, is a stroke of genius. It may seem cruel, but it is actually a profound act of consolation. By giving the suffering person a cause for their pain, he makes the pain meaningful. It is no longer a random, absurd agony. It is a punishment, a test, a sign of one's own moral failing. And if there is a cause, then there can be a cure. And the priest, of course, is the only one who possesses the cure. What is the prescription that the ascetic priest offers for this sickness of the soul? He does not, Nietzsche notes, actually heal the underlying cause of the disease. He only treats the symptoms. He is a master of numbing the pain, of providing temporary relief from the agony of a meaningless existence. He prescribes, first, mechanical activity. He tells the sufferer to lose themselves in mindless work, in the small daily routines that keep the mind from dwelling on its own misery. Second, he prescribes petty pleasures. He encourages small acts of kindness, of charity, of helping others. This gives the sufferer a temporary feeling of power and superiority over someone who is even more miserable than they are, a small but satisfying discharge of their will to power. Third, he prescribes the herd formation. He gathers the suffering together into a community, a church. This gives the individual a sense of belonging, of solidarity, of being part of something larger than their own small, miserable self. And finally, for the more extreme cases, he prescribes an orgy of feeling. He creates moments of intense emotional religious ecstasy that allow the sufferer to temporarily escape the pain of their own existence. This is the priest's great and terrible art. He does not cure the sickness of the soul. He organizes it. He gives it a meaning. He makes it manageable. And in doing so, he makes the suffering herd completely and utterly dependent upon him. This is his will to power. He becomes the master of the suffering. He is the shepherd of a sick flock, and his power depends on the flock never truly getting well. But the power of the ascetic ideal, Nietzsche saw, was not confined to religion. He was horrified to discover that its influence had infected the very heart of philosophy and art as well. The philosopher, he argues, has almost always been a secret servant of the ascetic ideal. From Plato, with his rejection of this sensory world in favor of a true world of pure forms, to Kant, with his abstract and bloodless categorical imperative, philosophers have shown a deep hostility to life, to the body, to the instincts. His prime modern example was the man he once revered as his great teacher, Arthur Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer's philosophy, which saw life as a meaningless, suffering-filled striving of the will, and which advocated for a denial of this will through art and asceticism as the only path to peace, was, for Nietzsche, the ultimate philosophical expression of the ascetic ideal. It was a philosophy born from a profound weariness with life. Even more personally agonizing for Nietzsche was the betrayal of the artist. The artist, he believed, should be the ultimate affirmer of life, the one who celebrates the senses, the passions, and the beautiful, terrible chaos of existence. And yet he saw his own former hero, Richard Wagner, succumb to this life-denying ideal. Wagner's final opera, Parsifal, with its celebration of Christian pity, chastity, and redemption through a denial of the self, was, for Nietzsche, an act of unforgivable treason. It was the great artist, the great affirmer of life, kneeling before the cross, kneeling before the ascetic ideal. This was the biographical agony that drove Nietzsche's critique. He was surrounded. The religion of his childhood, the philosophers he had studied, the artist he had worshipped, all of them, he concluded, were secret agents of this life-denying force. His own life was, from the outside, a picture of asceticism. He was poor, he was chaste, he was in a state of constant physical pain. His great philosophical war was, in many ways, a war against the temptation to find meaning in his own suffering, in the way the ascetic priest prescribed. He had to create a new, life-affirming ideal, or be consumed by the one he despised. And this leads him to his final, most chilling conclusion. What is the ultimate source of the ascetic ideal's incredible power? Why has humanity, for so long, preferred to believe in this ideal, rather than to believe in nothing at all? Because, he says, man would rather will nothingness than not will at all. Behind the priest's will to power, behind the philosopher's will to truth, behind this 2,000-year-long valuation of self-denial, lies a deep hidden and terrifying desire. The constant devaluing of this life, this body, this earth, this struggle in favor of a supposed other, better, and truer world, is an expression of a profound exhaustion with existence itself. It is a secret, unconscious will to nothingness. It is the suicidal desire of a suffering and decadent species for the end, for silence, for peace, for oblivion. It is the final, most sophisticated stage of nihilism, dressed up in the holy robes of morality and truth. And so Nietzsche unmasks the final, terrible secret hiding at the heart of our most sacred values. The ascetic ideal, the powerful engine of priests, saints, and philosophers, is not a testament to humanity's spiritual strength. It is a monument to our spiritual sickness. It is the most clever and most successful manifestation of the will to power ever devised. But it is a will to power in the service of a profound and secret desire for the end. For 2,000 years, he argues, humanity has not been striving for heaven. It has been perfecting the art of wanting to die. This devastating diagnosis of the ascetic ideal, this unmasking of a secret will to nothingness at the heart of our most sacred Western values, is the final act of Nietzsche's great destruction. The hammer has fallen, the idols lie in ruins. But Nietzsche was not a nihilist. His goal was not to leave us shivering in the abyss of a meaningless world. After the demolition, after the clearing of the ground, he sought to build, and the foundation for his new, radical, and life-affirming vision is his single most important, most misunderstood, and most central concept. It is the idea that he believed was the fundamental, driving engine of all reality. He called it the will to power. Now we must proceed with extreme caution. No concept in the history of philosophy has been more grotesquely misunderstood or more dangerously misappropriated than this one. When we hear the phrase will to power, our minds immediately leap to images of political tyrants, of brutal conquest, of a crude social Darwinist might makes right ideology. This is the simplistic and toxic interpretation that was later seized upon by the Nazis to justify their own barbarism. This is not what Nietzsche meant. To understand the will to power is to move beyond this brutish political caricature and to grasp a profound and subtle metaphysical and psychological principle. The first thing to understand is that the will to power is not just a human, psychological drive. For Nietzsche, it is the fundamental, intrinsic force of all existence. It is the cosmic engine that drives everything that is. It is the current that runs through every star, every plant, every animal, and every human being. What is this current? What does it want? Nietzsche is staging a great debate with the thinkers who came before him. He looks at the Darwinian idea of the struggle for existence, the idea that the primary drive of all life is simply to survive, to preserve itself, and he finds this to be a pathetic and limited explanation. He looks at the world and he does not see a timid desire for mere survival. He sees something far more ambitious, far more aggressive, and far more creative. Life, he argues, does not want self-preservation. In fact, life will constantly and joyfully risk its own preservation for the sake of something else. And that something else is growth. The will to power is the innate, insatiable drive of all things to expand, to overcome resistance, to grow, to become stronger, to discharge their strength, and to impose their own creative form on the world. A tree root does not just want to survive in the soil, it wants to grow. It will push its way through solid rock, risking its own destruction, in order to expand its reach. That is the will to power. A salmon does not just want to survive in the ocean, it will fight its way upstream against impossible currents, leaping over waterfalls, exhausting its own life force, simply to reach its spawning ground and create new life. That is the will to power. Life does not want peace or comfort. Life wants to overcome. The very essence of life is the overcoming of resistance. A life without struggle, a life without something to push against, would be a form of death. This cosmic principle then manifests itself in the human psyche in 1,000 different ways. The crude, most obvious form is the one we recognize, the desire of the warrior or the tyrant to physically dominate others. But this, for Nietzsche, is the most primitive and least interesting expression of the will. In more complex and more sophisticated human beings, the will to power is sublimated. It is channeled away from brute physical force and into more subtle, more spiritual, and more creative forms of overcoming. Consider the scientist. The scientist's will to power is sublimated into a will to truth. Their desire is to master the world, not with a sword, but with understanding. They seek to overcome the chaos and mystery of nature by imposing upon it the order and clarity of a rational scientific law. Consider the artist. The artist's will to power is a will to create. They take the raw, chaotic material of their experience, paint, stone, sound, words, and they impose upon it their own unique vision, their own creative form. The act of creating a great work of art is an act of magnificent tyrannical power over the formless. Consider the philosopher. The philosopher's will to power is a will to a system. They look at the terrifying, contradictory, and meaningless chaos of existence, and they have the audacity to try and force it into a coherent, meaningful framework. Every great philosophical system is a monument to the will of a single thinker to impose their own interpretation on the whole of reality. And, most perversely, consider the ascetic saint. As we have seen, even the act of self-denial is a subtle and powerful expression of the will to power. The saint wages war against his own instincts, his own body, his own nature. He seeks to achieve a perfect mastery over himself. And through this mastery, as we saw with the ascetic priest, he often achieves a profound and intoxicating power over others. This is the key. The will to power is not good or bad. It is a neutral, fundamental force, like gravity. The only question is how it is expressed, in a healthy, creative, life-affirming way, or in a sick, reactive, life-denying way. The biographical agony that gave Nietzsche such a unique insight into this principle was his own life. He was a man who, by all physical measures, was weak. He was plagued by debilitating illness, by chronic pain, by a body that constantly failed him. He did not possess the physical strength to be a warrior or a man of action, but within this frail and suffering body resided one of the most powerful and ferocious wills in the history of human thought. His entire philosophical project can be seen as the ultimate act of sublimated will to power. His agony was the profound and lifelong disconnect between his powerful, expansive spirit and his weak, decaying body. He could not conquer nations, so he set out to conquer the entire moral and philosophical tradition of the West. He could not fight soldiers, so he declared war on 2,000 years of religious and philosophical ideas. His books are not calm, detached arguments. They are battlefields. They are expressions of a will so powerful that it had to discharge its strength, even if the only material it had to work with was the world of ideas. His philosophy was his own personal and heroic act of self-overcoming. It was the transmutation of his own weakness and suffering into a philosophy of radical strength. He was the living proof that the will is not dependent on the health of the body. This is the great unifying and deeply unsettling secret that Nietzsche reveals. He shows us that everything we do, from the scientist's selfless search for truth, to the artist's creation of beauty, to the saint's act of self-denial, is just a mask. And beneath every mask is the same, single, primal face, the face of the will to power. Our noblest virtues and our most brutal vices are fed by the same immoral, cosmic fire. The great question he leaves us with is not how to extinguish this fire, for that is impossible. The question is whether we will be its masters or its slaves. This great cosmic current of the will to power, this amoral and relentless engine that drives all of existence, how can it be channeled? How can it be mastered, sublimated, and given a goal? After the devastating diagnosis of nihilism, after the horrifying vision of the last man, what is Nietzsche's prescription? What is his alternative? What is his hope for the future of humanity? The answer to this question is his most famous, his most aspirational, his most controversial, and his most dangerously misunderstood concept. It is the goal he sets for all of humanity in a world after the death of God. It is the Übermensch. The German word Übermensch is most commonly translated as the Overman, or sometimes the Superman. And it is here that we must begin with a crucial and absolute act of intellectual demolition. We must from the very outset shatter the disgusting and fraudulent idol that has been made of this concept. The Übermensch has been grotesquely twisted into a justification for the very things Nietzsche despised. It was hijacked by the Nazis, who, with the help of Nietzsche's anti-Semitic sister, refashioned it into a racial concept, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Aryan master race. This is a complete and total betrayal of Nietzsche's entire philosophy. The Übermensch is not a biological or a racial category. It has nothing to do with genetics, with nationality, or with the color of one's skin. The Nazi ideology, with its herd mentality, its mindless nationalism, and its resentful hatred of the other, is a perfect example of the slave morality that Nietzsche spent his entire life fighting against. The Übermensch is an individual ideal, not a collective one. So, let us be perfectly clear. The Übermensch is not a fascist thug. He is not a new race of biological supermen. He is a psychological and spiritual goal. He is the answer to a specific problem, the problem of nihilism after the death of God. To understand the Übermensch, we must return to Nietzsche's prophet, Zarathustra. When he first comes down from his mountain, this is the first and most important teaching he brings to the people. He declares, "I teach you the Übermensch. Man is something that shall be overcome." He uses a powerful metaphor. He says, "Man is a rope tied between beast and Übermensch, a rope over an abyss. We have evolved from the animal, but we are not the final goal of evolution. We are a transitional stage. We are a bridge. A dangerous, precarious, and magnificent bridge to something higher. The meaning of our existence, Zarathustra teaches, is not to be found in ourselves as we are, but in our capacity to become something more. The Übermensch is the meaning of the earth. After the death of God, after the collapse of all other worldly, heavenly values, humanity must find a new meaning, a new goal that is rooted in this world, in this life. The Übermensch is that new goal. So what then is this higher being? What are its characteristics? First and foremost, the Übermensch is a creator of values. This is the key. The death of God has created a great and terrifying vacuum. All the old moral tablets, the 10 Commandments, the foundations of good and evil have been shattered. Into this vacuum, the last man pours his trivial comforts and his mindless happiness. He seeks to live without values at all. The Übermensch, in contrast, recognizes this vacuum as a moment of tremendous and terrifying opportunity. If the old values are dead, then he is now free to create new ones. He does not discover values, he invents them. He does not obey a pre-existing moral law, he legislates a new one. He is the artist of morality. He takes the chaotic, meaningless clay of a godless existence and imposes upon it his own creative, life-affirming will. This is the highest possible expression of the will to power. Not the will to dominate others, but the will to create a new meaning for human existence itself. The second great characteristic of the Übermensch is self-overcoming. The German Übermensch can also be read as the self-overcoming man. The primary struggle for this new human is not against an external enemy. It is a war waged against the all-too-human within himself. It is a constant, ruthless battle against his own desire for comfort, his own moments of weakness, his own pity, and his own herd instincts. He is a creature who is perpetually dissatisfied with himself as he is, and who uses this dissatisfaction as the engine for his own constant growth. He has mastered his own passions. He has not destroyed them, in the manner of the ascetic priest. He has sublimated them, harnessed their immense power, and placed them in the service of his creative will. Third, the Übermensch is a being of profound life affirmation. He is the one who is strong enough to say yes to life in its totality. He does not need the comforting illusions of another world, of a heaven, of a divine justice that will make everything right in the end. He is strong enough to affirm this life, in all of its beauty, its horror, its joy, and its suffering, as a good in itself. This is the ideal of amor fati in its highest form. The Übermensch is the being who can look at the entirety of existence and not just accept it, but love it. And this leads to the ultimate test, the thought of the eternal recurrence. The Übermensch is the one who can look back on their life and say yes to the thought of living it again in every single detail for all eternity. Finally, the Übermensch is necessarily a solitary figure. As a creator of new values, he must stand outside and above the morality of the herd. He is a law unto himself. He cannot be understood by the people in the marketplace. Like Zarathustra, he is destined to be a lonely wanderer, a prophet whose message can only be understood by a few future souls. The biographical agony that haunts this concept is that Nietzsche knew, with a painful clarity, that he himself was not the Übermensch. He saw himself as the prophet, the John the Baptist figure, the forerunner who prepares the way for this higher being. His life was the agonizing attempt to clear the ground, to smash the old values, to make a space in which this new kind of human could one day, perhaps, emerge. His own constant struggle against his debilitating illness, his profound loneliness, and the Christian, all-too-human values that were bred into his own soul, this was his personal war of self-overcoming. His entire philosophy was a testament to the terrible difficulty of the very ideal he was proposing. He knew, better than anyone, how far humanity and he himself was from this goal. And so, we are left with Nietzsche's most demanding and most hopeful vision. After the death of God, after the coming of nihilism, he does not offer us a new God to worship or a new system to obey. He offers us a terrifying and glorious task, to become gods ourselves. The Übermensch is not a destination we will arrive at as a species. It is a possibility that haunts each of us as an individual. The meaning of the earth is not a truth to be discovered, it is a value that has not yet been created, and the future of humanity rests not in the hands of the collective, but in the lonely, creative, and courageous will of the one who is yet to come. This magnificent and terrifying goal, the Übermensch, is not a sudden state that one simply achieves. It is not a gift. It is an accomplishment. It is the end point of a long, difficult, and painful psychological and spiritual journey. But what does this journey look like? What are its necessary stages? How does a human spirit transform itself from a creature of the herd into a creator of new values? In one of his most beautiful, most poetic, and most powerful allegories, Nietzsche, through the voice of his prophet Zarathustra, gives us a map for this transformation. He calls it the 3 Metamorphoses of the Spirit. This is the story of how the human spirit must first become a camel, then the camel must become a lion, and the lion finally must become a child. Let us begin with the first stage, the camel. Zarathustra describes a spirit that is strong, patient, and reverent, a beast of burden. This is the spirit that wants to prove its strength by bearing the heaviest weights. It goes out into the desert, and it kneels down like a camel, and asks, "What is the heaviest thing, that I may take it upon myself and rejoice in my strength?" What are these heavy burdens? They are the great values of tradition and morality. They are the duties, the laws, the thou shalts that have been handed down for centuries. The camel spirit is the spirit of the good student, the dutiful soldier, the faithful servant of God. It is the spirit that demonstrates its strength through obedience, through discipline, and through its capacity to bear the immense weight of history and tradition without complaint. This is a necessary and honorable stage. Nietzsche is not a simple-minded preacher of rebellion. He has nothing but contempt for the anarchist who rejects all burdens simply because he is too weak to carry them. A spirit that has never been a camel, that has never learned discipline, that has never borne the great weight of a moral code, is a weak and shallow spirit. It does not have the strength or the depth necessary for the great transformations that are to come. You must first master the old values before you can have the right or the strength to destroy them. You must first know the rules before you can break them. The camel stage is the period of apprenticeship. It is where the spirit gathers its strength in the desert of tradition. It is, in many ways, the psychological task of the first half of life. It is the development of a strong ego, a disciplined character that has learned to live within the established order of the world. But for the noble spirit, this cannot be the final stage. Having taken on all the heaviest burdens, the camel journeys into the loneliest desert, and it is here, in the depths of its solitude, that the second metamorphosis occurs. Here, the spirit becomes a lion. The lion is a figure of pure predatory and majestic power. Its great task is to confront the most powerful and ancient of all enemies. In the loneliest desert, Zarathustra says, the lion finds a great, glittering dragon. The name of this dragon is Thou Shalt. On every single one of the dragon's golden scales, a value glitters, a commandment from the past. Thou shalt love thy neighbor. Thou shalt be humble. Thou shalt be chaste. Every rule, every law, every moral value that has been created over thousands of years is a scale on the body of this great dragon. The camel's spirit, the spirit of duty, is powerless before this creature. It can only kneel and obey. But the spirit of the lion has a different goal. It does not want to bear burdens. It wants to conquer. It wants freedom. It wants to become the master of its own desert. And so, the lion must fight the dragon. The dragon says, "All value has already been created, and I am all created value. Truly, there shall be no I will any more." And the lion, the king of beasts, responds with a sacred and terrible no. It cannot yet create new values. It cannot yet say I am, but it can fight for the freedom for new creation. It can say, with all its majestic and holy rage, I will. The lion is the spirit of the great rebel, the great critic, the great destroyer. It is the spirit of the Enlightenment skeptic who dares to question the authority of the church. It is the spirit of the revolutionary who dares to overthrow the old political order. It is the spirit of the philosopher with a hammer. Its task is destruction. It must slay the dragon of Thou Shalt to clear a space for its own sovereign will. This, of course, is a perfect map of Nietzsche's own biographical agony. His years as a brilliant and disciplined classical philologist at the University of Basel, that was his camel stage. He knelt down and took upon his own back the entire heavy burden of the Western intellectual and moral tradition. He mastered it completely. He knew its history, its languages, its every argument, but this mastery led him into the loneliest desert of his own solitude. And it was there, after his break with academia and his break with Wagner, that he became the lion. His entire philosophical project, from that point on, was a war against the great dragon of thou shalt. He was the lion, tearing at the golden scales of 2,000 years of Judeo-Christian morality, of Platonic philosophy, of life-denying value. His books are the record of this great and terrible battle. But even this is not the final stage. For what can the lion do after it has slain the dragon? It can say, "I will." It has won its freedom. But it cannot create anything new. The act of destruction, of rebellion, of saying no, does not in itself create a new value. For that, a final and most miraculous transformation is needed. The predatory lion must become a child. Why a child? What can a child do that the lion cannot? The child, for Nietzsche, is a symbol of innocence and of forgetting. The child is not burdened by the past. It is not defined by the memory of the great battle it has just fought. It is free from the spirit of revenge and resentment. The child is a new beginning. It is a first movement, a self-propelled wheel. It does not need a reason to act. It acts out of a pure, spontaneous, and overflowing joy. And because of this, the child can do what the lion could not. The child can create. It can say a sacred yes to life. The child is the spirit of play. It creates its own world, its own games, its own values, not out of a sense of duty, like the camel, not out of a spirit of rebellion, like the lion, but out of a pure, creative, and life-affirming joy. This is the state of the Übermensch. The spirit that has first learned discipline, then won its freedom, can finally become a creator of new values. This is Nietzsche's beautiful and challenging map of the soul's great journey. It teaches that to become a creator, you must first be a beast of burden. To win your freedom, you must become a predator. And to finally achieve the highest state of human wisdom, you must have the courage to forget everything you have learned and become a child again. The path to the Übermensch does not end in the defiant roar of a lion, but in the innocent, creative, and world-creating laughter of a child at play. This final metamorphosis into the child, this spirit of the sacred yes that creates its own values, is not just a psychological state. It is a new and radical relationship to existence itself. To create new values that are rooted in this world, the spirit must first learn to affirm this world in its terrifying and beautiful totality. It must learn to say yes, not just to the parts of life that are pleasant and convenient, but to everything. This is the great challenge. This is the ultimate test of a noble soul, and this is the great formula for human greatness that Nietzsche discovered in the depths of his own suffering. He called it by a Latin name, amor fati. The literal translation is, a love of one's fate. Now we have encountered this idea before, in our study of the Stoics. They too believed in accepting what one cannot change. But Nietzsche's amor fati is something entirely different, something far more passionate, more dangerous, and more ecstatic. The Stoic acceptance of fate is a noble, but ultimately weary, act of resignation. It is based on the belief that the universe is governed by a perfect divine reason, the Logos. The Stoic submits to fate because it is rational and necessary to do so. It is a philosophy of endurance, a shield to protect oneself from the pain of a world one cannot control. It is a beautiful, but ultimately defensive, posture. Nietzsche's amor fati is not defensive. It is an offensive weapon. It is not a calm, rational acceptance. It is a passionate, joyful, and unconditional embrace of everything that is. It is born not from a belief in a rational, ordered cosmos, but from the terrifying recognition that the universe has no inherent meaning, no divine plan, and no moral order. It is a chaotic, amoral, and eternal interplay of the will to power. And in the face of this chaotic reality, the Nietzschean spirit does not seek peace. It seeks to love the chaos itself. Amor fati is the desire that nothing be different. Not in the past, not in the future, not for all eternity. It is the ability to look at your life, In its entirety, with every single victory, every agonizing defeat, every moment of joy, every second of excruciating pain, every mistake, every shame, every loss, and to not just accept it, but to will it, to love it, to declare that you would not have a single detail changed. This is a direct and total war against the most poisonous and life-denying of all human emotions, regret and the spirit of revenge. The psychology of resentment, the engine of the slave morality, is rooted in an inability to accept the past. It is the brooding, vengeful spirit that looks at what has happened and says, if only I had been born to different parents. If only I had not made that mistake. If only my enemy had not triumphed. This is the spirit that is at war with time, that cannot forgive reality for being what it was. Amor fati is the ultimate cure for this sickness. It is the active willing of what has been. It is the supreme act of a powerful will that takes the entire unchangeable past and stamps upon it the seal of its own approval. It is to look back on the ruins of your own life and say, I willed it thus, and I would will it so again. This is a profound act of self-creation. It transforms you from a passive victim of your own history into the active creator of its meaning. But how is such a love possible? How can one love the moments of agony, of illness, of humiliation? Because, Nietzsche argues, the noble soul understands that suffering is not a mistake. It is not an unfortunate accident to be avoided. Suffering is the necessary and indispensable ingredient for any form of human greatness. Our modern compassionate, last man culture is built on the desire to eliminate all suffering. We seek comfort, safety, and a life free from pain. Nietzsche saw this as a profound and decadent misunderstanding of life. He uses the metaphor of a mountain climber. The greatest feeling of joy, the most breathtaking view, the most profound sense of accomplishment comes only after the most difficult, most dangerous, and most painful ascent. To wish away the struggle, the pain, the risk of falling, is to wish away the very conditions that make the final triumph possible. Greatness and suffering are not opposites. They are two sides of the same coin. You cannot have one without the other. He speaks of the discipline of great suffering. He argues that this is the force that has created every elevation of man so far. The tension in the soul in the face of great misfortune, the spiritual strength developed in the need to overcome great resistance. This is what makes a human being deep, noble, and creative. As he famously wrote in a moment of profound personal insight, "What does not kill me makes me stronger." This is the logic of amor fati. You love your suffering, not because you are a masochist, but because you understand that it is the very tool that is carving you into something more than you were before. The biographical agony that underpins this entire concept was Nietzsche's own life. By any objective standard, his life was a catalogue of misfortunes. He was plagued from a young age by debilitating physical illnesses that brought him to the brink of death, time and time again. He lived in a state of almost constant, agonizing pain. He was a professional failure. His books largely ignored or misunderstood during his lifetime. And he lived in a state of profound, almost total, intellectual and personal loneliness. His was a life that would have given anyone else every reason to curse their fate. And yet, it is in the heart of this suffering that he formulates the philosophy of amor fati. He does not complain. He does not wish for a different life. Instead, he transforms his own pain into his greatest philosophical weapon. In his autobiography, Ex Homo, he writes with a shocking and beautiful gratitude for his own illness. He says that his sickness gave him a new perspective, that it allowed him to see the healthy values of his time from the outside, to diagnose their hidden decadence. He had to become sick to understand the true meaning of health. He had to suffer to understand the true meaning of strength. He did not just endure his fate, he actively chose it. He loved it. He saw his own agonizing life not as a punishment, but as the necessary condition for his unique and world-changing mission. This is the mindset of the Übermensch. The Übermensch is the being who is strong enough to practice amor fati perfectly. He does not need the comforting illusion of a heaven to justify the suffering on earth. He does not need a divine plan to give meaning to tragedy. He finds the justification and the meaning in the tragedy itself. He is strong enough to look at the totality of existence, with all its chaotic, meaningless, and often horrific reality, and to say yes. This is the fiery, joyful, and terrifying heart of Nietzsche's affirmative philosophy. He teaches that the highest state a human being can achieve is not to conquer their fate, but to fall in love with it. True freedom is not found in the power to change what happens to you, but in the power to will that it happen exactly as it. The ultimate celebration of life is not a prayer for happiness and comfort, but a sacred and resounding yes to the entire beautiful and horrifying drama of existence, with not a single detail removed. This powerful and joyful embrace of one's fate, this sacred yes to all of existence, this is the great formula for human greatness that Nietzsche called amor fati. But how can one know if they have truly achieved it? How can we test the strength of our own life-affirming will? Is there a thought, a single idea, so powerful that it could serve as the ultimate crucible for the human spirit? Nietzsche, a man who loved the most difficult and most dangerous questions, believed that there was. He conceived of a thought experiment so profound, so terrifying, and so world-altering that he called it the greatest weight. This is the ultimate test of amor fati. This is the thought of the eternal recurrence. To understand this idea, we must turn to a passage of breathtaking power from his book, The Gay Science. Nietzsche does not present this as a logical proof. He presents it as a story, a personal confrontation. He asks you to imagine a scenario. What if, he writes, some day or night, a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, this life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more, and there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything unutterably small or great in your life will have to return to you, all in the same succession and sequence, even this spider and this moonlight between the trees, and even this moment and I myself. Imagine this. The demon is not offering you a new life or an afterlife in heaven. He is offering you this life, your actual life, the one you are living right now, with all its triumphs, all its glories, but also all of its regrets, its shames, its moments of agonizing boredom, its petty compromises, and its most excruciating pains. And you will not just live it once more, you will live it innumerable times, forever, with not a single detail changed. The demon then asks the ultimate question, would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, you are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine? This is the test. What would your honest, immediate, gut-level reaction be? The first reaction, the reaction of most of humanity, would be one of absolute horror. To be condemned to repeat this life with all its suffering and all its mistakes, forever, it sounds like the most terrible of all possible hell. This, for Nietzsche, is the reaction of a spirit that is not at peace with itself. It is the reaction of a life that is filled with regret, with resentment, with a secret and profound dissatisfaction. It is the reaction of a person who is living a life they would not want to repeat even once, let alone for all eternity. It is the reaction of the last man. But then there is the second reaction, the reaction of the noble soul of the spirit that has achieved the state of amor fati. This is the reaction of a person who has lived with such intensity, such courage, such creativity, and such a profound love for their own fate, that the thought of repeating it all is not a curse, but the greatest possible blessing. To be able to look the demon in the eye and say, you are a god, is to have lived a life so fully and so well that you would not trade it for any other. It is the ultimate and final affirmation. It is to stamp the seal of eternity upon your own existence. Now, it is crucial to understand that Nietzsche is not necessarily presenting this as a cosmological theory about the literal nature of the universe. He is presenting it as a thought experiment. It is a practical, psychological, and ethical principle. It is the greatest weight because it forces you to confront the single most important question you can ever ask yourself. Am I, right now, living a life that is worthy of being repeated for all eternity? This is not a question about the past. It is a question about the present. It is a tool for transforming how you act in this very moment. If you knew that every single choice you make, every word you speak, every action you take, you would have to experience again, innumerable times, exactly as you are doing it now, how would that change your behavior? It would give every single moment an almost unbearable and infinite significance. Would you waste this hour on a mindless distraction, knowing that you would be condemned to waste it for all eternity? Would you choose the act of cowardice over the act of courage, knowing that your cowardice would echo forever? Would you say the cruel word, or would you choose the kind one, knowing that the sound of that word would never fade? The eternal recurrence is a filter. It is a new center of gravity for the soul. It forces you to live as if your every action were carving an eternal groove into the fabric of reality. It compels you to live in such a way that you could will the eternal return of every single moment. This is the biographical agony that lies at the heart of this idea. Nietzsche himself, according to his own account, was crushed and transformed by this thought. He writes that it came to him in a flash of insight during a walk in the Swiss Alps, near a great pyramidal rock in Sils Maria. He called it his most abysmal thought. It was a thought that filled him with both a profound horror and a kind of ecstatic joy. His agony was the immense personal and intellectual challenge of living up to the standard of his own most terrible idea. He, a man whose life was defined by almost constant physical suffering, by professional failure, and by a deep, crushing loneliness, he had to find a way to affirm his own tormented life to such a degree that he could joyfully will its eternal return. His entire later philosophy, his creation of the Übermensch, his celebration of amor fati, his war against all life-denying values, can be seen as his heroic attempt to build a philosophy that would make it possible for a human being to pass this terrifying test. The Übermensch is the being who is strong enough to not only bear the thought of the eternal recurrence, but to love it. The Übermensch is the one who hears the demon's message and responds with a triumphant divine laughter. This is the final, most abysmal, and most life-affirming of all of Nietzsche's ideas. He gives us a thought that is the greatest weight, a burden that threatens to crush us with the infinite significance of every moment. And yet, it is only by taking on this greatest weight that our spirit can learn to dance. The eternal recurrence is not a promise of immortality. It is a challenge to live this mortal life with such courage, such love, and such creative fire that you would not trade it for any paradise, but would will it to be your only paradise, again and again, forever. This terrifying and exhilarating thought of the eternal recurrence, this greatest weight, forces us to affirm every single moment of our lives. It is the ultimate test of a life lived with courage and a love of fate. But what is the nature of the reality that we are affirming? What is the status of the truth of our existence? For more than 2,000 years, from Plato to the philosophers of his own day, the entire project of Western philosophy had been built on a single foundational assumption: the quest for the truth. It was the search for a single, objective, eternal, and universal reality that exists independently of our own minds, a God's-eye view of the world, a truth that was absolute and unchanging. Nietzsche takes his hammer to this, the most sacred and most ancient idol of all philosophers, and with this final act of demolition, he clears the ground for his most radical and most influential contribution to modern thought. This is his assault on truth itself. He begins, as he always does, with a genealogical question. He does not ask, "What is truth?" He asks a far more penetrating and suspicious question: what is the value of our will to truth? The traditional view, held by almost every philosopher and scientist, was that the truth is the highest possible value, that the pursuit of truth is always and everywhere a noble and virtuous activity, that truth is intrinsically better than falsehood or illusion. Nietzsche challenges this sacred assumption. What, he asks, is the psychological motivation behind our relentless and often fanatical desire for truth? Is it really a pure and disinterested love of knowledge, or is it, perhaps, something else? He comes to a shocking conclusion. He argues that the will to truth is, in many cases, a disguised and sophisticated symptom of the ascetic ideal. It is a manifestation of a decadent, life-denying will. Why? Because the desire for the truth is a desire for a world that is fixed, stable, predictable, and eternal. It is a desire for a true world, like Plato's world of forms or the Christian heaven, that stands behind this messy, chaotic, and ever-changing world of life and becoming. The will to truth, he argues, is often a sign of weakness. It is the desire of a spirit that cannot handle the terrifying dynamic and perspectival nature of reality itself. It is a subtle and sophisticated form of escapism. We create a true world of concepts, of laws, of eternal facts, because we are afraid of the real world of life. Having put the very desire for truth on trial, he then proceeds to his great positive doctrine, the doctrine of perspectivism. This is one of his most famous and most radical claims. He declares that there are no absolute truths. There is no God's eye view of reality. There is no view from nowhere. As he famously wrote in one of his notebooks, there are no facts, only interpretations. To understand this, imagine a complex and beautiful sculpture. You can walk around this sculpture and observe it from an infinite number of different angles. From this angle, you see a certain set of lines and shadows. From that angle, you see a completely different set. From up close, you see the texture of the stone. From far away, you see its overall form. Which of these is the true view of the sculpture? The question is absurd. Each perspective is a true and valid representation of the sculpture from that particular point of view. But none of them, on its own, captures the entire complex reality of the object. To claim that your one single perspective is the truth would be an act of arrogant foolishness. Reality itself, Nietzsche argues, is like this sculpture, and every living being, every human being, every culture, every philosophy is looking at it from a different perspective. Each perspective is an interpretation, a way of organizing the chaos of experience into a meaningful picture. And what drives these interpretations? The will to power. Every perspective, every system of truth, every philosophy, every science is a manifestation of a particular will to power. It is an interpretation of the world that serves the life, the growth, the expansion, and the power of the being that holds it. A scientist looks at the world and interprets it through the lens of causality and mathematical laws. This is a powerful and incredibly useful perspective. It is a will to power that seeks to master the world by predicting and controlling it. But it is not the truth, it is one perspective. A religious person looks at the world and interprets it through the lens of divine purpose and moral law. This is also a powerful and life-enhancing perspective for many. It is a will to power that seeks to master the world by giving it a sacred meaning. But it is not the truth. It is another perspective. There is no disinterested search for truth. To even look at the world is to already be interpreting it, to be selecting certain things as important and ignoring others, all in the service of your own deepest needs and instincts. In one of his earliest, unpublished essays, On Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense, Nietzsche gives a breathtaking, poetic definition of what we call truth. He says, "What, then, is truth? A mobile army of metaphors, metonyms, and anthropomorphisms, in short. A sum of human relations which have been enhanced, transposed, and embellished poetically and rhetorically, and which after long use seem firm, canonical, and obligatory to a people. Truths are illusions about which one has forgotten that this is what they are." Let's break that down. He is saying that our truths begin as creative, artistic leaps. They are metaphors. We take the strange, unknowable chaos of reality and we try to describe it in our own, limited human terms. Over time, through long use, we forget that these are just metaphors. They become hard, solid, and seemingly objective concepts. They become the facts that make up our reality. And we completely forget that we ourselves were the ones who created them. The biographical agony that led Nietzsche to this radical conclusion was his own training as a classical philologist. His entire academic discipline was based on the careful, rigorous, and objective interpretation of ancient texts in order to discover their one true meaning. He was a master of the will to truth in its scholarly form. His entire philosophical journey, therefore, was a profound and difficult rebellion against the very foundation of his own training. He had to overcome his own deeply ingrained instinct as a scholar to arrive at this more profound, more artistic, and more honest understanding of the nature of truth. This insight condemned him to an even deeper solitude. He could no longer participate in the shared truths of his culture, its morality, its religion, its science, without a sense of ironic distance. He saw them all as just one possible interpretation, one set of useful and powerful fictions among many. He was a man who had stepped outside the matrix, and he could now see the code, and it was a profoundly lonely position to be in. Now, this is where we must be careful. Does this mean that all perspectives are equal? That anything goes? that my interpretation is just as good as yours. No, Nietzsche was not a lazy relativist. He believed that while no perspective can be true in the absolute sense, some perspectives are far better than others. And what is the standard of judgment? The will to power. Some interpretations are healthier, stronger, more life-affirming, and more conducive to the enhancement of power than others. A perspective that leads to strength, creativity, and a love of life is superior to one that leads to weakness, decadence, and resentment. The goal for the noble spirit is not to be without a perspective. That is impossible. The goal is to have many perspectives. He called this having many eyes. The stronger, more flexible, and more intellectually powerful a spirit is, the more perspectives it can entertain. The more different eyes it can look through to see the world. This, for Nietzsche, is the real meaning of objectivity. And so we are left with Nietzsche's final and most dizzying act of demolition. He takes the very foundation of all philosophy, the search for truth, and reveals it to be just another idol, another comforting illusion. But he does not leave us in a cynical relativism. Instead, he offers a new and more demanding ideal of honesty. True objectivity is not found in the impossible dream of a single, God's eye view of reality. It is found in the difficult, courageous, and life-affirming art of learning to see the world through as many different eyes as possible. To become more truthful, he teaches us, we must first have the courage to admit that all our truths are, in the end, nothing more than our most useful and most beautiful fictions. This radical idea that our truths are beautiful fictions, that our world is a work of art, created by our own will to power, leads us back to the very beginning of Nietzsche's thought. Before he was a genealogist of morals or a prophet of the Übermensch, he was a classical philologist. His first great and scandalous book was not about morality or the death of God. It was about art. Specifically, it was his attempt to answer a profound and ancient question. From what deep, primordial forces is the greatest and most life-affirming art born? Why did the ancient Greeks, a people who were so clear-eyed about the terror and the absurdity of existence, not succumb to a pessimistic nihilism? His answer lay not in a single principle, but in an eternal and creative struggle between two rival and complementary forces. Two gods who in their cosmic battle and their miraculous reconciliation gave birth to the highest art form humanity has ever produced, Greek tragedy. These are the two great artistic deities of the Greeks, Apollo and Dionysus. To understand Nietzsche, we must first understand this fundamental duality. Let us begin with Apollo. Apollo is the god of the sun, of light, of clarity, of reason, and of order. He is the god of the sculptor, who takes a formless block of marble and gives it a perfect, beautiful, and idealized form. He is the god of the dreamer. The dream for Nietzsche is the perfect metaphor for the Apollonian state. In our dreams, a world of beautiful, coherent images is created. It is an illusion, a world of pure appearance, but it is a world that has a clear structure and a radiant beauty. The Apollonian impulse is the force that creates this beautiful, dreamlike illusion that shields us from the chaos and the darkness of the night. It is the principle of individuation. It is the force that creates boundaries, that draws lines, that gives form to the formless. It is the part of us that creates the stable, ordered, and beautiful illusion of our own individual self, our ego. Apollonian art is the art of the beautiful lie, the necessary illusion that makes life bearable. But beneath this beautiful, dreamlike surface of individual forms, Nietzsche saw a deeper, more terrifying, and more fundamental reality. This was the realm of the second god, Dionysus. Dionysus is the god of wine, of music, of intoxication, of frenzy. He is the god who shatters all boundaries. The Dionysian state is a state of ecstatic and often terrifying intoxication. In the Dionysian frenzy, the principle of individuation, the illusion of the separate, individual self, completely dissolves. The boundaries collapse, and what is revealed when the self dissolves? You experience a mystical, primal unity with the heart of existence itself. You feel the eternal, chaotic, and contradictory flow of life, the great primordial will that is the engine of the universe. And this experience is one of both ecstasy and horror. It is ecstatic because you are reunited with the great, undifferentiated oneness of all things. But it is horrifying because this primal reality is a world of constant, meaningless suffering. To experience the Dionysian is to look directly into the abyss, into the terrible truth of a world without inherent meaning or purpose. It is a truth so overwhelming that it would shatter the individual who experienced it without some form of protection. The Apollonian dream is the beautiful illusion that protects us from this terrifying Dionysian truth. Now, Nietzsche's first great thesis in his book The Birth of Tragedy is that the miracle of the ancient Greeks was that they did not choose between these two forces. Unlike other cultures, which either succumbed to the chaotic, barbaric impulses of the Dionysian or retreated into a purely rational, Apollonian worldview, the Greeks had the incredible strength to hold these two enemy gods in a state of perfect creative tension. And the art form that was born from this miraculous synthesis was Greek tragedy. To understand this, we must look at the structure of a play by Aeschylus or Sophocles. The play consists of two distinct elements. On the stage you have the individual characters, Oedipus, Antigone, Prometheus. They speak in clear, rational dialogue. They are noble, beautiful, dreamlike figures. They are the Apollonian element. They are the beautiful illusion, the story. But in the orchestra pit below the stage, there is another, older and more fundamental presence, the chorus. The chorus does not speak, it sings. It does not act, it chants and dances in a state of Dionysian frenzy. It does not represent an individual, but the collective primordial voice of the people, of nature, of the suffering heart of the world itself. The music of the chorus is the pure, raw, chaotic sound of the Dionysian. The miracle of Greek tragedy, Nietzsche argued, was that it allowed the audience to experience the terrifying, Dionysian truth of existence. But it did so through the beautiful mediating and healing illusion of the Apollonian story. The suffering of the Dionysian chorus flowed up onto the stage and was given a beautiful, individual form in the tragic fate of the Apollonian hero. The audience could look into the abyss, but they were shielded from its full destructive power by the beautiful dream of the story. This, for Nietzsche, was the highest and healthiest form of art ever created. It was an art form that had the courage to look directly into the darkness, but the strength to turn that darkness into a thing of beauty. It was an art that said a profound yes to the tragic, terrible, and beautiful nature of life. But this perfect, miraculous balance did not last. The tragedy, Nietzsche argues, did not die a natural death. It committed suicide. And who were the murderers? The first was the playwright Euripides. He brought a new kind of character onto the stage, the ordinary, common, psychological man. He replaced the grand, mythic, Apollonian heroes with realistic, relatable characters. He put the spectator on the stage. But the true villain of Nietzsche's story, the great demon who stands behind Euripides, is Socrates. Socrates, with his relentless questioning, his demand for rational explanations, and his famous equation of knowledge is virtue happiness, represents the triumph of a new and, for Nietzsche, a profoundly sick and life-denying force: optimistic rationalism. The Socratic spirit cannot tolerate mystery. It cannot bear a reality that is chaotic, contradictory, and tragic. It believes that reason can penetrate all the secrets of the universe, and that a life based on reason will be a happy one. This optimistic scientific spirit, Nietzsche argues, is terrified of the Dionysian. It looks at the dark, chaotic, and musical heart of tragedy, and it does not understand it. And what it does not understand, it seeks to destroy. So, Socrates and Euripides killed Greek tragedy. They drove the Dionysian chorus from the stage and replaced it with a shallow, logical, and ultimately boring psychological realism. The great, tragic art that affirmed life in all its horror was replaced by a new, optimistic art that offered simple moral lessons and a happy ending. This, for Nietzsche, was the original sin of Western culture. It was the moment that our civilization chose the pale, bloodless light of reason over the dark, chaotic, and creative fire of life itself. The biographical agony that fueled this entire vision was Nietzsche's own profound love for Greek culture and his grief at what he saw as its death. And it was also the agony of his relationship with Richard Wagner. The Birth of Tragedy was not just an academic book. It was a passionate and hopeful prophecy. Nietzsche saw in the powerful mythic and music-driven operas of Wagner the possibility of a modern rebirth of the tragic spirit. He saw Wagner as the artist who would finally reunite Apollo and Dionysus and heal the sickness of modern culture. His later bitter break with Wagner was the death of this great youthful hope, a profound personal and philosophical disillusionment that would shape the rest of his life. This is Nietzsche's great tragic vision of art. He teaches us that the highest and most life-affirming culture is not the one that is the most optimistic, but the one that has the courage to look directly into the terrifying, chaotic heart of existence and not be destroyed by it. The greatest art is not a flight from suffering, but a beautiful, dreamlike illusion that is stretched over an abyss of terrible truth. It is the miraculous synthesis of a lie that tells the truth, and a truth that can only be born through the saving grace of a beautiful lie. This great synthesis of the tragic and the beautiful, this vision of an art that could affirm life in its totality, was not just a theory for Nietzsche, it was a creative ambition. After he abandoned the dry, academic conventions of philosophy, after he declared war on the moral systems of the past, he knew he needed a new way to express his ideas. The old forms were too tired, too decadent, too saturated with the very life-denying spirit he was trying to overcome. To announce a new set of values, he needed a new voice. To deliver a new gospel, he needed a new prophet. And so, he created a prophet to speak for him. And he wrote a book that is not a philosophical treatise, but a new kind of scripture, a fifth gospel for a godless world. This is his most personal, most poetic, his most famous, and his most revolutionary work. Thus spoke Zarathustra. To read this book is to enter a completely different world. It is not written in the language of logical argument, it is written in the language of prophecy, of poetry, of parable, of myth. It is a work of literature that is designed to be chanted, to be sung, to be wrestled with, not just to be understood. Nietzsche chose this form deliberately. He believed that a philosophy that is merely understood by the intellect, but not felt in the bones, is a dead philosophy. To communicate a new life-affirming vision, he had to create a new life-affirming form. His chosen mouthpiece is the ancient Persian prophet, Zarathustra, or Zoroaster. Nietzsche makes a brilliant and ironic choice here. The historical Zarathustra was, in his view, the first great moralist, the first thinker to have created a comprehensive metaphysical system of good and evil. Therefore, Nietzsche reasons, the one who made the first great error must be the first one to recognize and overcome it. His Zarathustra is a figure who has gone beyond his own ancient teaching. The book begins after Zarathustra has spent 10 years in solitary contemplation on a mountaintop, like a hermit or a holy man. But his solitude has made his wisdom overflow, and like a sun that is too full of its own light, he feels the need to descend, to go down among humanity and bestow his gift. This very first act is a symbolic inversion of the entire religious tradition. The holy man does not ascend into heaven to be with God. He goes untergehen in the German, he descends to be with humanity. His path is not away from the earth, but towards it. And this becomes the first sermon of his new gospel, the first commandment of his new anti-religion. He comes to the people in the marketplace, and he declares, I beseech you, my brothers, remain faithful to the earth, and do not believe those who speak to you of otherworldly hopes. This is a direct and total declaration of war on 2,000 years of Platonism and Christianity. It is a rejection of every philosophy and every religion that has devalued this life, this body, this earth, in favor of a supposed true world beyond a heaven, a world of forms and nirvana. Zarathustra teaches that these otherworldly hopes are a poison, a slander against life, invented by the weary and the decadent who are too weak to affirm their own earthly existence. Having rejected the old goal of heaven, he must now give humanity a new goal, and this is the central message of the book. He looks at the crowd and says, man is a rope tied between beast and Übermensch, a rope over an abyss. Humanity as we know it, he declares, is not the endpoint of evolution. It is a bridge, a transitional stage to something higher. And then he gives humanity its new meaning. The Übermensch is the meaning of the earth. This is the new gospel. The goal is not to prepare our souls for another world. The goal is to prepare the world for a new and higher kind of human being. Zarathustra also preaches a new reverence for the body. He rejects the ascetic ideal's hatred of the flesh. He declares, The body is a great reason. He teaches that the soul is not a separate, spiritual entity trapped in the prison of the body. The soul is just an aspect of the body. To despise the body and its instincts is to despise life itself. But how do the people in the marketplace respond to this new gospel? They do not understand. They laugh at him. When he speaks of the Übermensch, they think he is talking about a tightrope walker who is performing in the square. They are the last men. They are not interested in a difficult aspirational goal. They want to be promised comfort and security. And so, as we have seen, Zarathustra, in a fit of disgust, preaches to them about the pathetic, contemptible future they are choosing for themselves. This is the great tragedy that defines the entire book. Zarathustra is a prophet with the most important message in the world, and no one is ready to hear it. This is the profound biographical agony at the heart of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. The book is a thinly veiled and deeply personal allegory for Nietzsche's own life. Zarathustra's crushing, almost unbearable loneliness was Nietzsche's own loneliness. He wrote this book in a state of almost total isolation, a solitary wanderer with no students, no community, and no peers who could understand his radical vision. The book was his only companion. Zarathustra's desperate search for true disciples, for higher men who could share his vision, was Nietzsche's own desperate and ultimately failed search for intellectual and spiritual comrades. The ecstatic, almost manic, and often deeply sorrowful tone of the book is a direct reflection of the intense psychological states that Nietzsche himself was experiencing. He wrote that the core ideas for Zarathustra came to him not as reasoned arguments, but as overwhelming, ecstatic inspirations during his long solitary hikes in the high Alps. He felt that he was not the author of the book, but its vessel, a mouthpiece for a truth that was speaking through him. Zarathustra's journey is the journey of his creator. And as the book progresses, Zarathustra, having been rejected by the herd, retreats back to his mountain. He realizes that his teaching is not for everyone. He must now seek out a few, select individuals, the higher men. In the final part of the book, he gathers these higher men in his cave. They are a strange collection of figures. A king, a retired pope, a sorcerer, the ugliest man. They represent the best of the old, dying world. They understand that the old God is dead, but they do not yet know how to create a new one. And here, Zarathustra faces his final and most difficult temptation. He is overcome with pity for these suffering, transitional figures. He knows that pity, for him, is the ultimate life-denying emotion. It is the central virtue of the slave morality he has come to destroy. To feel pity for these men would be to drag them down, to affirm their suffering rather than calling them to overcome it. He must overcome this final weakness in himself. He must overcome his own compassion to become the hard, joyful, and creative spirit who is ready for the coming of the Übermensch. And so we are left with Nietzsche's strangest and most personal creation. He wrote a book that was meant to be a new Bible for a new humanity, and almost no one read it in his lifetime. He created a prophet to speak his gospel to the world, and that prophet's greatest lesson was the necessity of his own solitude. Thus Spoke Zarathustra is the loneliest book ever written, and yet it is a desperate and beautiful love letter to a future humanity that Nietzsche could only hope would one day be strong enough to understand it. It is the gospel of a God who is yet to come, written by a prophet who was tragically and necessarily alone. This lonely and ecstatic vision of the prophet Zarathustra, this gospel for a future humanity that had learned to create its own values, was not a safe or a stable thing to create. To be the vessel for such a world-shattering philosophy, to live in a state of such profound intellectual and personal isolation, to wage a constant, solitary war against the entire moral foundation of your civilization, this takes a terrible toll on the human mind. And for Friedrich Nietzsche, the creator, the final price of his own magnificent and dangerous creation was absolute. This brings us to the last and most tragic chapter of his conscious life, the descent into madness. The year is 1888. It is the final year of Nietzsche's productive life. He is living in Turin, Italy, and he is engulfed in an almost superhuman burst of creative fire. It is as if he knows that his time is running out, and he is desperately trying to get his final message down on paper. In the space of just a few months, he completes an astonishing series of works. He writes Twilight of the Idols, a brilliant and concise summary of his entire philosophy. He writes The Antichrist, his final furious assault on Christianity, and he writes his strange, beautiful and egomaniacal autobiography, Ecce Homo, with its chapter titles like Why I'm So Wise, Why I'm So Clever, and Why I Write Such Good Books. The tone of these final works is a mixture of ecstatic self-affirmation and a kind of apocalyptic urgency. He sees himself as a figure of world historical importance, a man whose work will split the history of humanity in two. His mind is burning at its absolute brightest, a star going supernova just before it is extinguished forever. The end came in January of 18. The story, now a legend, is this. Nietzsche was walking through a public square in Turin when he saw a cab driver brutally flogging an old, stubborn horse. Nietzsche, the man who had preached a hard, anti-compassionate philosophy, a man who had declared war on the morality of pity, suddenly broke. He ran to the horse, threw his arms around its neck to protect it, and then collapsed to the ground, sobbing. He would never return to sanity. This was the final, tragic and deeply ironic act of his conscious life. The great immoralist was broken by a moment of profound and overwhelming compassion. In the days that followed his collapse, he sent out a series of short, strange, and terrible letters to his friends and to the great political figures of Europe. They are known as the Madness Letters. In them, the careful psychological distinctions he had built his entire life had completely dissolved. His ego was gone, overwhelmed by the great archetypal forces he had spent his life analyzing. He signed the letters with the names of gods and saviors. Sometimes he was Dionysus. At other times he was the crucified. He was both the ecstatic, life-affirming God of the Greeks and the suffering, self-sacrificing God of the Christians. The two great antagonists of his own philosophy now fused together in his shattered mind. He issued decrees to the kings of Europe, commanding them to assemble in Rome. He declared that he was having the German Kaiser shot. He wrote, simply, I am God. These were the last coherent, though completely delusional thoughts of the great philosopher. After this, the light went out. The inevitable and difficult question is, what happened? What was the cause of this catastrophic collapse? For decades, the standard diagnosis was a neurological disease, most likely tertiary syphilis, which he had supposedly contracted as a young man. This theory seemed to fit the megalomania, the gradual decay, the eventual paralysis. All were consistent with the final stages of this terrible illness. But in recent years, modern medical scholarship has challenged this old diagnosis. Some researchers have argued that his symptoms do not perfectly align with syphilis. Alternative theories have been proposed. A slow-growing brain tumor or a rare, hereditary form of dementia that affects the frontal lobes of the brain. We will likely never know for certain. The cause of his madness remains, in the end, a medical and historical mystery. But this leads us to the more profound and more philosophically significant question. What was the relationship between his philosophy and his madness? This is the central biographical agony of his legacy, the unanswerable question that has haunted his work from the very beginning. The romantic and popular interpretation is that his madness was the result of his philosophy, that he was a man who stared too long and too deeply into the abyss, and the abyss, as he famously warned, stared back into him. In this view, his mind was a casualty of his own dangerous ideas. He had declared the death of God, he had dismantled all of morality, he had embraced the chaos of a meaningless universe, and the sheer psychological weight of this vision was too much for any single human mind to bear. He was the first great martyr of his own nihilistic prophecy. There is a tragic, poetic power to this interpretation, and it may contain a piece of the truth. But there is another, perhaps more profound and more psychologically astute way to see it. This is the view that his philosophy was not the cause of his illness, but was, in fact, a heroic lifelong and ultimately tragic battle against it. In this view, Nietzsche was a man who, from a young age, felt the encroaching chaos of his own neurological fragility. The headaches, the sickness, the strange ecstatic states, these were the early symptoms of a physical disease that was slowly taking over his brain. His entire philosophy, then, can be read as a magnificent and desperate act of self-therapy. His relentless celebration of health, of strength, of self-mastery, this was the cry of a man who was almost never healthy a day in his life. his creation of the Übermensch, the figure who can organize the chaos of their own instincts into a creative and purposeful whole. This was the ideal he was desperately trying to achieve in the face of his own encroaching mental disintegration. His command to love one's fate, his amor fati. This was the ultimate tool he had to forge to be able to endure a life of almost constant and medically inexplicable physical and mental suffering. His philosophy was not a descent into madness. It was a heroic attempt to build a fortress of the will against a madness that was coming for him, from the inside, all along. We will never know for sure which of these interpretations is true. The tragic ambiguity is now a permanent and inseparable part of his legacy. For the final 11 years of his life, Friedrich Nietzsche was a ghost. He lived in a state of quiet, gentle, and almost complete mental darkness. He was cared for first by his mother, and then, after her death, by his manipulative and anti-Semitic sister, who began the process of editing and twisting his work to fit her own vile ideology. The great mind was gone. He was a helpless invalid, a child, completely unaware that his books, which had been almost totally ignored during his lifetime, were now beginning to explode across Europe, and would soon set the intellectual world on fire. And so we are left with the final, terrible, and silent tragedy of Friedrich Nietzsche. The man who lived his life as a monument to the power of the human will spent his last decade as a helpless child. The philosopher who celebrated an ecstatic Dionysian life ended his days in a quiet, empty twilight. His mind, which had been a hammer that shattered the idols of a civilization, was itself shattered, leaving behind a legacy that was as brilliant as dangerous and as tragically unanswerable as the mystery of his own final silence. This final silent decade of Nietzsche's life, this long, tragic twilight, was not an empty period. While the man himself was gone, a helpless invalid, his work was just beginning its explosive and dangerous journey into the world. And the first person to seize control of this intellectual dynamite, the first to become the self-appointed priestess of his new and dangerous gospel, was the one person in the world he trusted the least. This is the story of the great betrayal. It is the story of how Nietzsche's profound and deeply personal philosophy was hijacked, twisted, and forged into a weapon for the very barbarism he spent his entire life fighting against. This is the story of the Nazi betrayal. To understand this tragedy, we must first meet its primary architect, Nietzsche's younger sister, Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche. Elisabeth did not share her brother's brilliant, independent, and iconoclastic spirit. She was a conventional, deeply nationalistic, and virulently anti-Semitic woman. In every essential aspect, her worldview was the polar opposite of her brother's. Their relationship was fraught with conflict. Nietzsche was appalled by her marriage to a leading anti-Semite named Bernhard Förster. He saw the anti-Semitic movement of his day as a pathetic and disgusting expression of her sentiment, the very slave morality he despised. He broke off contact with her for years over this issue, writing to her with undisguised contempt for her and her anti-Semitic rabble. But after his mental collapse in 1889, Nietzsche was helpless. He became the patient, and she, after the death of their mother, became the nurse. More importantly, she became the executor of his entire literary estate. She gained control of his published works, and most crucially, of the vast, chaotic, and unpublished collection of notebooks from his final, most productive years. And she immediately began a project of systematic and often fraudulent curation. She established the Nietzsche Archive in Weimar, which she ran not as a scholarly institution, but as a kind of cult, with herself as its high priestess. Her greatest and most damaging act of intellectual forgery was the creation of a book that Nietzsche himself never wrote. She took hundreds of her brother's unpublished notes from the 1880s, notes that were often fragmentary, experimental, and contradictory, and she selectively edited them, took them out of context, rearranged them, and cobbled them together into a single, massive, and seemingly systematic book. She gave this book a title that Nietzsche had once considered for a project he never completed, The Will to Power. This book, which was presented to the world as Nietzsche's final, crowning masterpiece, was in fact a distortion. It overemphasized the most aggressive and seemingly political aspects of his thought, while downplaying his critiques of nationalism and anti-Semitism. It turned his dynamic, aphoristic, and often paradoxical philosophy into a rigid, dogmatic system that seemed to endorse a crude, social Darwinist worldview. It was this fraudulent book, more than any other, that would become the primary lens through which the next generation would read his work. And in the decades that followed, a new and brutal political movement began to rise in Germany, a movement that was desperately searching for a philosophical pedigree to legitimize its own thuggish and resentful ideology. They found it in the distorted image of Nietzsche that his sister had so carefully crafted. The Nazis were seduced by the language of Nietzsche, even as they remained completely blind to its meaning. They heard his talk of masters and slaves, of the will to power, of the blonde beast, and of the Übermensch, and they read it all through the crude biological and racial lens of their own ideology. Elisabeth Förster Nietzsche, a committed Nazi herself, welcomed this. She saw it as the final, triumphant vindication of her brother's work. The most infamous and damning image of this betrayal is a photograph from 1934. It shows Adolf Hitler, the Führer, visiting the Nietzsche archive as an honored guest. He is greeted by the elderly Elizabeth. He stands, gazing reverently at a bust of the philosopher, as if receiving a blessing from a patron saint. In this single obscene image, the hijacking was complete. The philosopher who despised nationalism, who loathed anti-Semitism, and who celebrated the sovereign individual, had been posthumously turned into the prophet of a racist, collectivist, and totalitarian state. Let us, then, perform an act of intellectual justice. Let us use Nietzsche's own words to dismantle this grotesque misunderstanding, point by point. First, the Nazis claimed him as a great prophet of German nationalism. This is an absurdity that can only be sustained by someone who has never actually read his work. Nietzsche's writings are filled with a profound and unrelenting contempt for the German nationalism of his day. He called the German state the coldest of all cold monsters. He mocked the idea of a superior German culture, seeing it as increasingly vulgar, mediocre, and decadent. He did not see himself as a German philosopher. He repeatedly and passionately identified himself as a good European. His great hope was for a future in which national boundaries would dissolve, and a new transnational, aristocratic elite would guide the destiny of the continent. Nationalism, for him, was a petty, herd instinct that stood in the way of this higher vision. Second, the Nazis claimed him as a great anti-Semite. This is a deliberate and vicious lie, made possible only by his sister's forgeries. Nietzsche's published writings and his personal letters are filled with some of the most furious and articulate denunciations of anti-Semitism of the entire night. He saw the anti-Semitic movement as a sickness, as a scandal, as a perfect expression of the spiteful ressentiment of the weak and the failed. His break with his friend Richard Wagner was, in large part, over Wagner's growing and vulgar anti-Semitism. His break with his own sister was for the same reason. He wrote to his sister about her husband's anti-Semitic cause with pure, undisguised disgust, calling it a despicable movement led by resentful mediocrities. Third, the Nazis seized upon the ideal of the Übermensch and twisted it into the ideal of the Aryan master race. This is perhaps the most profound of all the misunderstandings. As we have discussed, the Übermensch is a psychological and spiritual goal for the individual. It is the lonely, creative soul who overcomes the herd morality within himself to create his own values. The Nazi ideal of the master race is the exact opposite. It is a demand for the total and absolute subordination of the individual to the collective, to the herd, to the race. It is a biological, not a spiritual, concept. Nazi ideology is the ultimate expression of the herd morality that Nietzsche spent his entire life fighting against. Finally, they seized upon his phrase, the blonde beast. They read this as a literal racial description of the superior Aryan. Nietzsche, the classical philologist, was using this as a historical anthropological metaphor. He was describing the primal, immoral, and predatory vitality he saw in the ancient pre-civilized warrior aristocracies, the Homeric heroes, the Roman nobles, the Vikings. He called them beasts, precisely because they were pre-moral, operating beyond our concepts of good and evil. He was not endorsing them as a model for modern man, and he was certainly not describing a racial type. The posthumous agony of Nietzsche is this ultimate powerlessness of a dead thinker to defend his own work from the hands of those who would corrupt it, especially when the chief corrupter is his own sister. It is the supreme tragedy that his philosophy, which was a profound and personal struggle against the psychology of resentment, was hijacked by the most resentful and murderous political movement in all of human history. And so we are left with the final and most grotesque irony of Nietzsche's legacy. The man who declared war on the herd became its idol. The philosopher who despised German nationalism and loathed anti-Semitism was hailed as a prophet of the Third Reich. His work, a profound and personal struggle for the liberation of the great sovereign individual, was twisted into a justification for the mass enslavement and murder of millions. The greatest immoralist in history, who sought to move beyond good and evil, suffered the ultimate moral tragedy: to have his own name, after his death, become synonymous with the purest evil the modern world has ever known. This grotesque betrayal by the Nazis was for a time a dark cloud that obscured Nietzsche's true legacy. For a generation, his name was unjustly associated with the very herd instincts and resentful barbarism that he had so ferociously despised. But after the Second World War, as a new generation of thinkers in a shattered and disillusioned Europe tried to make sense of a world that had been ravaged by totalitarianism, genocide, and 2 world wars, they rediscovered his work. They blew away the dust of the Nazi misappropriation, and they saw him not as a prophet of fascism, but as the great and terrifying prophet of their own condition. The condition of living in a world after the death of God, in a world where all the old values had collapsed into a pile of rubble. These were the existentialists. Nietzsche, alongside the tormented Christian faith of Søren Kierkegaard and the profound psychological novels of Fyodor Dostoevsky, is one of the 3 great fathers of the existentialist movement. But while Kierkegaard and Dostoevsky wrestled with the struggle for faith in a world where meaning was in doubt, Nietzsche was the one who took the final, most ruthless step. He was the one who dared to philosophize from the abyss, to take the death of God not as a problem to be solved, but as the fundamental, unshakable starting point for all future thought. His influence was particularly profound on the great French existentialists, who came to define the intellectual climate of the mid-20th century. Thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus. Let us first turn to Sartre. Sartre lived through the Nazi occupation of Paris. He experienced, firsthand, a world where traditional morality had proven to be utterly powerless in the face of brute force. After the war, he sought to build a new philosophy for a new, godless age. And the foundation of his entire system is a direct inheritance from Nietzsche. Nietzsche's great proclamation was "God is dead." Sartre took this idea and translated it into his own famous central axiom: existence precedes essence. What does this mean? For thousands of years, Western thought had believed the opposite. It had believed that essence precedes existence. If you want to build a table, you first have an idea, a blueprint, an essence of the table in your mind, and then you bring it into existence. The religious version of this is that God has an idea of human nature, an essence, in his mind before he creates us. Our purpose in life is to live up to this pre-existing blueprint. But if God is dead, then there is no divine craftsman. There is no pre-existing blueprint. There is no such thing as a universal preordained human nature. We are, in Sartre's stark and terrifying phrase, simply thrown into existence. We exist first. We just find ourselves here, in the world, without a script, without a manual, and without a purpose. And it is only after we exist, through the choices we make, through the actions we take, that we create our own essence. You are nothing but what you make of yourself. This is the direct and logical consequence of Nietzsche's death of God. And this leads to another of Sartre's famous and deeply Nietzschean ideas, that we are condemned to be free. We cannot escape our freedom. There are no excuses. We cannot blame God, or human nature, or our unconscious drives, or our social conditioning. At every single moment, we are choosing who we are. And this freedom is a terrible and absolute responsibility. This is the great burden that Nietzsche placed upon his Übermensch. The Übermensch is the one who understands that there are no pre-existing values, and therefore he must create his own. Sartre takes this a step further. He argues that when an individual chooses, they are not just choosing for themselves, they are in effect choosing for all of humanity. In choosing how to live your life, you are presenting to the world an image of how you believe all human beings ought to live. This is the crushing weight of existential freedom, a direct echo of the creative burden that Nietzsche celebrated. If Sartre was the inheritor of Nietzsche's ideas about freedom and value creation, then his contemporary, Albert Camus, was the great inheritor of Nietzsche's diagnosis of nihilism. Camus's central philosophical concept is the absurd. The absurd for Camus is not a quality of the world itself, it is a relationship. It is the divorce, the confrontation between two things. The deep, passionate, and irrational human longing for meaning, for clarity, and for unity, on one hand, and the cold, silent, and indifferent universe on the other. We cry out for answers, and the universe offers us nothing but its unreasonable silence. This is the absurd. It is the human condition. What is the proper response to this? In his great essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus explores this question. He uses the ancient Greek myth of Sisyphus as his central metaphor. Sisyphus was a king who, for his transgressions against the gods, was condemned to an eternity of futile and hopeless labor. His punishment was to push a massive boulder up a mountain, only to watch it roll back down to the bottom the moment he reached the top. And he had to do this, again and again, forever. This, for Camus, is a perfect image of the absurd human life. We spend our days on repetitive, often meaningless tasks, all of which will ultimately be erased by death. But Camus, at the end of his essay, makes a shocking and defiant conclusion. After describing this scene of utter hopelessness, he writes the famous line, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy." Why? Because Sisyphus is conscious of his fate. He knows his condition is hopeless. He knows his labor is futile. And it is in this lucid consciousness that his freedom lies. As he walks back down the mountain to retrieve his rock, he is free. He is the master of his own suffering. He can rebel against his fate through the power of his own scorn. By consciously embracing his absurd and tragic condition, by finding his meaning in the struggle itself, he becomes greater than the rock that is meant to crush him. This happy Sisyphus is a direct, almost perfect echo of Nietzsche's ideal of amor fati. It is the ultimate act of saying yes to a life of struggle and suffering. It is the ability to look at a meaningless, repetitive, and agonizing existence, and not just endure it, but to find a kind of bitter, defiant, and joyful victory within it. The biographical agony of these existentialist thinkers was that they were the children of Nietzsche's prophecy. They were the first generation of European intellectuals to have to live and think in the cold, harsh reality of a world after the death of God, a world whose spiritual foundations had been turned to dust by 2 world wars and the rise of totalitarian nightmares. Their philosophies were not abstract, academic games. They were a desperate and courageous attempt to build a new foundation for human freedom and human dignity out of the rubble that Nietzsche had left behind. They had to stare into the abyss that Nietzsche had opened, and they had to find a reason to not leap into it. And so we see Nietzsche's final and most profound intellectual legacy. The man who seemed to be the great immoralist, the destroyer of all values, became the unwitting godfather of the great 20th century movements for human freedom and responsibility. His declaration of the death of God was not the end of meaning. It was the terrifying and necessary beginning of a new project. The project of creating a human meaning without the comfort of a divine justification. The existentialists had to walk into the abyss that Nietzsche had opened, and it was only there, in the total darkness of a godless world, that they could begin to create a new and perhaps more difficult kind of light. The existentialists, in their courageous attempt to build a new humanism from the rubble of the 20th century, were the first true inheritors of Nietzsche's legacy. They were the ones who had to live in the world that he had prophesied. But what is that legacy in its totality? After the hammer has fallen, after the idols are shattered, after the abyss of nihilism has been opened, what remains? We have arrived at the final part of our long and difficult journey. We must now try to assess the full, explosive, and enduring impact of the man who once called himself, with perfect accuracy, dynamite. First and foremost, Nietzsche's legacy is that of the great diagnostician. He was the ruthless and unflinching doctor of modern culture. He looked at the proud, self-satisfied civilization of 19th century Europe and saw not health but a deep and creeping sickness. His diagnosis was brutal. He declared the death of God, not as a triumphant cry, but as a statement of fact about the collapse of the central foundation of Western meaning. He prophesied the coming of nihilism, the 2 centuries of meaninglessness that would follow this event, a spiritual plague that would manifest as both the quiet despair of the last man and the violent rage of active destruction. And he performed the great genealogy of morals, uncovering the hidden, all-too-human origins of our most sacred values. He argued that our Judeo-Christian morality, the very thing we considered to be the source of our goodness, was in fact a sophisticated slave morality, born from the vengeful hatred, the resentment of the weak against the strong. This was his great destructive project. He was the philosopher who came not to bring peace, but a sword. He came to clear the ground, to burn away the decadent and life-denying values that had, in his view, made the human animal sick, tame, and mediocre. But he was not merely a destroyer. His demolition was a necessary prelude to a great and dangerous act of creation. And this is the second part of his legacy, his affirmative vision. After the old God was dead, after the old morality was unmasked, he sought to give humanity a new, life-affirming goal, a new reason to live. He gave us the concept of the will to power, not as a crude lust for domination, but as the fundamental, creative, and expansive engine of all life, the drive to grow, to overcome, and to discharge one's strength. He gave us the ideal of the Übermensch, the overman, not a racial superman, but a psychological and spiritual goal. The creator of new values, the human being who has overcome nihilism and has the strength to give meaning to the earth. He gave us a map for the journey to this higher state, the allegory of the three metamorphoses, the transformation from the dutiful camel to the rebellious lion to the creative child. And he gave us the tools, the ultimate tests of the strength of our own will. He gave us amor fati, the love of one's fate. Not the weary resignation of the Stoic, but the passionate, joyful, and total embrace of all of life's beauty and all of its horror, seeing both as necessary parts of a great and beautiful whole. And he gave us the greatest weight, the terrifying and exhilarating thought of the eternal recurrence. The ultimate challenge to live your life in such a way that you would joyfully will its return, in every single detail, for all eternity. This is the twofold nature of his legacy. He was the great destroyer and the great creator, the diagnostician of nihilism, and the first to offer a way beyond it. But what is the final practical meaning of his work for us today? Nietzsche's ultimate legacy is not a system of philosophy to be learned and memorized. He would have despised that. He did not come to give us a new set of tablets, a new dogma to believe in. He came to give us a challenge. He came to force a question upon us. The biographical agony of his life was his profound loneliness, the agony of a prophet who knew that his true readers had not yet been born. He was writing for a future humanity, and the question he poses to us, the inheritors of the godless world he prophesied, is this: now that the old foundations are gone, what will you do? Will you succumb to the passive nihilism of the last man? Will you seek only comfort, security, and a trivial, mindless happiness? Or will you have the courage to become a creator? To take upon yourself the terrifying freedom and the immense responsibility of forging your own values, of giving your own life a meaning? He does not solve the problem of nihilism for us. He hands the problem to us. His philosophy is not a destination, it is a crossroads. It forces a choice, and it is in this that we find his most profound relevance. We live today in a world that is more and more like the world of the last man, a world that prizes safety above all else, that seeks to eliminate all risk, all pain, all hardship. Nietzsche stands as the great eternal counter-argument to this world. He reminds us that greatness and suffering are inextricably linked, that the human spirit does not grow through comfort, but through the overcoming of resistance, that a life without a great love, a great struggle, or a great purpose is not a life worthy of the name. And so we are left with the ultimate paradox of Friedrich Nietzsche. He was a man who wrote with a hammer, yet his goal was to teach us how to dance. He was the great immoralist, yet he subjected morality to a more intense and more serious scrutiny than any of the great moralists who came before him. He declared the death of God, yet he gave humanity the most sacred, most difficult, and most divine of all tasks, to become gods ourselves. His philosophy is not a safe harbor, it is a storm at sea. It does not offer us peace, but a sword. And his final, enduring legacy is not a set of answers that will make us comfortable, but a set of questions that will, if we have the courage to truly hear them, make us great.